June 4th, 1944. Evening. General Dwight Eisenhower stares at a weather report that could doom 150,000 Allied soldiers to death. Day and night, he and his team had stayed in constant touch with the weather office. The news wasn't good. Ships based in northern England were already heading for the Channel when a violent storm broke. Eisenhower was forced to call back all vessels that had already set sail. Operation Overlord, the invasion that would either save the world or destroy it, now hung in the balance. The forecast was poor for the next fortnight. That would spell disaster. The men would need remotivating. The full campaign would be shortened by 2 precious weeks. In the ports where Eisenhower had delayed departure, the weight became unbearable. Landing craft circled and circled like crocodiles in a waterhole. On that day, June 4th, a mood of bitter disappointment came over the Allied forces. That night, in 30 minutes, Eisenhower would take a decision that would change the course of the world. The Supreme Allied Commander faced a choice between 2 forms of catastrophe: attack in terrible weather, or delay and risk losing the war entirely. But this moment of terror actually began with a lie so massive, it fooled the entire German war machine. For months, German spies had been watching something extraordinary unfold across the fields of southeastern England. Through their binoculars and telephoto lenses, they observed what appeared to be the largest military build-up in human history. Hundreds of Sherman tanks gleamed in neat formations. Bomber squadrons filled entire airfields. Supply depots stretched to the horizon. There was just one problem. None of it was real. The tanks were inflatable rubber decoys. The aircraft were plywood and canvas mock-ups. The supply depots were painted wooden boxes, filled with nothing but air and Allied hopes. This was Operation Fortitude, the most audacious military deception in the history of warfare. Leading this phantom army was General George S. Patton himself. The Germans knew Patton's reputation. They knew he was America's most aggressive tank commander. So when they spotted him inspecting these massive formations directly across from Calais, German intelligence reached exactly the conclusion the Allies wanted. The main invasion would come at Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. Over in Britain, the ploy continued with the installation of phony airfields just across from the Calais coastline. Fields of inflatable aeroplanes sprang up like mushrooms after rain. Radio operators broadcast fake traffic 24 hours a day, creating the electronic signature of massive military units. Fictional divisions received supplies. Imaginary commanders held strategy meetings. Ghost soldiers sent letters home about their preparations for the big show. The deception was so complete that German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt concentrated his strongest forces at Calais. The 15th Army, Germany's most powerful defensive force in Western Europe, waited and watched the Dover cliffs. Massive coastal guns pointed their barrels toward Patton's rubber tanks. Rommel's best minefields protected the beaches where no Allied soldier would ever set foot. Meanwhile, the real invasion force assembled in southwest England, Hampshire, Dorset, Devon. While elsewhere in the south of England, where the majority of troops were assembled, supplies arms, and munitions were kept well camouflaged. By the month of May, it was no longer possible to conceal the enormity of the means being deployed. But the Germans weren't looking in the right direction. German intelligence had been so thoroughly fooled that even after the Normandy landings began, Hitler still believed Patton's First Army would launch the real invasion at Calais. For weeks after day, Germany's 15th Army remained pinned to the Pas de Calais, defending beaches from an attack that would never come. 50,000 of Germany's finest soldiers, trapped by shadows and canvas dreams. But this deception succeeded because 3 of the world's most powerful men had made a deal that changed everything. And that deal was forged in the mountains of Iran, where Joseph Stalin delivered an ultimatum that terrified Franklin Roosevelt to his core. December 1st, 1943. The Tehran Conference. 3 heads of state had just made a key decision that would determine the fate of the world. The satisfied-looking Joseph Stalin stood at the top of the steps, supreme leader of the Soviet Union and its armies. Lower down, the concerned-looking British Prime Minister Winston Churchill shifted uncomfortably in the Iranian heat. Between them, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the man who held the balance of power in his paralyzed hands. For 2 years, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt had been struggling to reach an agreement on the invasion date in Western Europe. The outcome of the war, and of the world, would depend upon it. But behind the diplomatic smiles and carefully staged photographs, a deadly game of geopolitical chess was playing out. Stalin's position was brutally simple. From the moment his country entered the war with Germany in June 1941, the Soviet leader had been demanding the opening of a second front in the West. His armies were bleeding white against the Wehrmacht. 2 million Soviet soldiers had already died. His cities lay in ruins. His people were starving. And Churchill kept stalling. Meanwhile, influenced by Churchill, who feared attacking Germany head-on, the Anglo-Americans had vainly hoped to weaken the Axis by passing through North Africa in order to invade southern Europe via Italy. However, they were stopped short near Naples and were unable to advance any closer to Germany. Stalin saw this Mediterranean strategy for what it was, a way to avoid the real fight while Soviet blood watered European soil. Behind closed doors in Tehran, Stalin delivered his ultimatum. Open the second front in France by spring of 1944, or the Soviet Union would consider making a separate peace with Germany. The implication hung in the mountain air like poison gas. If Stalin switched sides, if Soviet resources and manpower joined the Nazi war machine, the Western Allies would face a fortress Europe that stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. Roosevelt understood the mathematics of terror. America was strong, but not strong enough to fight a Nazi-Soviet alliance. Britain would fall within months. The Third Reich would control everything from Lisbon to Vladivostok. For a long time, Roosevelt had been hesitant. He didn't think his country was ready enough for such a huge operation. However, he now wanted to put an end to the Third Reich as soon as possible, and to do so in the West. Churchill could only resign himself to it. The Prime Minister who had stood alone against Hitler in 1940 now watched his influence slip away to American power and Soviet threats. But he also understood reality. Without Stalin's armies, there was no victory over Nazi Germany. Without Roosevelt's industrial might, there was no hope of survival. The deal was struck in Tehran's mountain air. Day would happen in 1944, or the Grand Alliance would shatter and Hitler would inherit the earth. But across the Channel, Germany's most brilliant general had been watching the Allied build-up with growing alarm. And what Erwin Rommel saw convinced him that Hitler's 1,000-year Reich had perhaps 6 months to live. In 1942, Hitler had appointed one of his most brilliant generals to a task that would determine the fate of Nazi Germany. Erwin Rommel, the popular field marshal known as the Desert Fox, had spent years tormenting the British in North Africa. After commanding the Afrika Korps, this cunning soldier had thwarted British forces time and time again. So it was only natural for the Führer to entrust this energetic general with reinforcing the defences of Fortress Europe. By early 1944, Rommel was in France conducting the most thorough inspection of German defences that any general had attempted. What he found horrified him. With the Nazi Air Force stationed in Germany to counter Allied bombing raids, he was unable to use it in Normandy. The theatre of war would be the land and the beaches, which he considered badly defended. Hitler had boasted of an Atlantic wall running almost 4,000 miles from northern Norway to the Spanish border. The reality was a scattered collection of concrete bunkers, with enormous gaps between them. Rommel wanted to fill in the gaps between fortified towns with a continuous line of defence. He also asked for the coast to be more heavily mined. However, one mine is a mere drop in the ocean when you consider that from Calais to Lower Brittany, France has 750 miles of coastline. The field marshal was trying to defend the impossible with the inadequate. But Rommel's greatest frustration wasn't with concrete and steel. It was with the German high command itself. He faced a strategic nightmare that would doom every soldier under his command. Marshal von Rundstedt, chief of the Western Front, wanted to keep German armoured divisions inland so they could converge on precise zones after the Allies had landed. Rommel believed that British and American aviation would paralyse German troop movements. He therefore wanted to bring the armoured divisions as close as possible to the coast to confront the enemy as they were landing. However, his wishes were rejected. Hitler, paralysed by indecision, split the difference and satisfied no one. Some tanks stayed inland. Some moved to the coast. All would arrive too late when the moment of crisis came. Rommel focused on what he could control. He installed anti-tank obstacles along every beach where landing craft might approach. They also set up anti-landing craft barrages and chevaux de frise built from old railroad tracks, making any advance almost impossible. He even altered the terrain to impede the landings and movements of paratroopers. When possible, the Germans intentionally flooded land just inside the coast. But the Desert Fox knew mathematics as well as he knew warfare. The Allies would bring overwhelming force, more ships, more planes, more men than Germany could match. His only hope was to smash the invasion at the water's edge in the first 6 hours before Allied superiority could establish itself. If the Allies gained a foothold, any foothold, the war was lost. In his private reports to Hitler, Rommel painted a picture of coming catastrophe. The Atlantic Wall was a propaganda myth. German forces were spread too thin. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength. The Kriegsmarine could barely challenge Allied control of the Channel. Against Allied industrial might and growing military superiority, Germany was fighting a war it had already lost. Hitler's response was predictable. Ignore the warnings. Demand impossible miracles. Blame subordinates for speaking unwelcome truths. The Führer, who had conquered most of Europe through audacious gambles, now refused to face the consequences of his greatest gamble failing. As 1944 progressed toward its date with destiny, Rommel continued his desperate work. More obstacles, more mines, more concrete. But in his heart, the Desert Fox knew he was building monuments to German defeat rather than bulwarks of German victory. While Germans built their fortress, 3 young men with cameras were about to witness something no human eyes had ever seen, and one of them wouldn't survive to tell the story. In the chaos and carnage that would become day, most heroes would remain forever anonymous. Faces lost in crowd scenes, names buried in casualty lists, stories untold. But 3 young men with cameras made a choice that would preserve this history for the world and cost one of them his life. 27-year-old Sergeant Ian Grant always wore his Scottish beret with unmistakable pride. He had chosen the film corps not for glory, but to escape from mundane military chores and to immortalize his brothers in arms. Grant understood something that most soldiers didn't, that this moment in history was too important to disappear into memory's fog. Someone had to be there with a camera when young men changed the world. But Grant wasn't alone in his mission. The youngest among them was 20-year-old Desmond O'Neill, barely old enough to vote, but old enough to die for freedom. O'Neill had volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire invasion, filming the actual assault while under enemy fire. His youth worked in his favor. "My camera was welcome," he would later remember. It distracted them. The soldiers appreciated O'Neill's presence because his camera represented something beyond the immediate horror of what they were about to face. It meant their sacrifice would be remembered. It meant their families would see their courage. It meant history would record not just the outcome, but the price. These men knew they had a good chance of being killed, O'Neill observed, and that created a strange mood. The third member of this unlikely trio was Norman Clegg, a cameraman whose story would end tragically in the Norman countryside. All that history would preserve of Clegg was his clapperboard, that simple piece of equipment used to sync sound with film. But in the coming weeks, Clegg would capture some of the most powerful footage of liberation and reconciliation ever filmed. German prisoners and Allied wounded receiving equal medical care. The first moments when enemies became simply human beings again. 5 days after day, Clegg would be killed by German fire while filming near the front lines. His final footage would show compassion amid carnage, wounded German soldiers being treated by Allied medics with the same care given to British and American boys. Even in war's darkest hours, Clegg found humanity worth preserving on film. These 3 men, Grant, O'Neill and Clegg, were part of a larger group that military historians have largely forgotten. Students of the British Army Film School, all volunteers, all entrusted with capturing the preparations for posterity. They carried 16mm cameras into landing craft. They filmed soldiers vomiting from seasickness. They documented the moment when boys became men under fire. Like their subjects, they had been made sergeants, the ideal rank to stay close to the men without being burdened by command responsibilities. They understood that great historical moments happen in small, human details. A soldier's nervous laugh, a prayer whispered before battle, the weight of equipment pulling a man down into cold channel water. Among all these men, forever unseen, of course, were those who filmed the events, those we never see in their own footage. The cameramen who risked everything to ensure that June 6th, 1944, would never be forgotten. They were soldiers first, historians second, and heroes always. But before they could film history, they had to survive the waiting. And in those final days before the invasion, even simple meals became sacred rituals for men who didn't know if they would live to eat again. May 27th, 1944. In camps across southern England, Allied soldiers were introduced to something that seemed almost absurd in its normalcy: French francs printed by the Allied forces. Much to the anger of General Charles de Gaulle, who saw it as a breach of French sovereignty since only France should be allowed to print or mint its money. For the moment, he was kept out of the loop and had little idea of what was being planned. But for the men who held those crisp new francs in their hands, the currency represented something profound. These weren't just pieces of paper, they were tickets to liberation. Proof that the Allies intended not just to visit France, but to stay and restore its freedom. Some soldiers pocketed the money as souvenirs. Others studied the unfamiliar designs, wondering what French shops they might visit if they lived long enough. By June 1st, the nature of their meals had changed dramatically. These weren't regular military rations anymore. Grant filmed them receiving extra provisions, additional food being handed out to men as they readied to face the worst. "We just sat there on board with nothing to do other than eat or smoke," O'Neill would remember. "We didn't lack victuals. I had 10 men's rations just for me." The abundance was intentional. Military planners knew that many of these men would not survive the next 48 hours. If these were to be their last meals, they would at least be memorable ones. Chocolate became more common. Cigarettes flowed freely. Even luxuries like coffee appeared in quantities that peacetime soldiers never saw. But food was only part of the preparation for what many believed would be their final hours on Earth. Never had religious services been attended so keenly as on Sunday, June 4th, 1944, in all the ports of southern England. The Canadians were known for their devout Christianity, and maybe that made them pray so hard for the help they would soon need. But denomination didn't matter that weekend. Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, men of all faiths crowded into makeshift chapels and gathered around military chaplains. The prayers were different too. Not the routine recitations of peacetime worship, but desperate conversations with God. Requests for courage. Pleas for survival. Promises of better behavior if granted another sunrise. Some men who had never prayed in their lives found themselves speaking to whatever power might be listening from beyond the storm clouds gathering over the English Channel. O'Neill captured these moments with his camera, rows of young faces, eyes closed, lips moving silently. Some clutched letters from home. Others held photographs of sweethearts or children they might never see again. The footage shows something remarkable: fear transformed into determination through faith. Men who were terrified but resolved. Soldiers who knew they might die but refused to let that knowledge break their spirit. The Americans, meanwhile, tried to keep busy because they knew that nothing fatigued men as much as being idle, which would make them more vulnerable on the big day. Card games continued around the clock. Letters were written and rewritten. Equipment was checked and rechecked with obsessive precision. Anything to keep minds occupied and hands busy, while hearts hammered with anticipation. But beneath all this activity, the eating, the praying, the endless preparation, lay a terrible knowledge that no one spoke aloud. Statistics were brutal and unavoidable. In any major amphibious assault, casualty rates approached 50%. Half of these young men, sharing final meals and final prayers, would never return to England. Half would never use those French francs in liberated towns. Half would never tell their grandchildren about the day they helped save the world. As evening fell on June 5th, the waiting finally ended. And in the darkness, some of the strangest and most moving rituals in military history began to unfold. Late in the afternoon of June 5th, 1944, at Greenham Common Airfield, General Eisenhower made a decision that revealed everything about his character as a leader. A few hours before they took off on what might be their final mission, he visited the US 101st Airborne Division. They would be amongst the first to reach French soil, assuming they survived the drop. Ike's smiling face masked his underlying tension. All the more reason for paratroopers to put on a brave face and reassure their leader. But Eisenhower understood the mathematics of death as well as any general in history. American airborne troops would lose over half their equipment and 1 in 5 of their men in the coming hours. 1 in 5 would never see another sunset. That evening, Eisenhower stayed till the end, till the last plane had taken off. He watched young men he had just spoken with disappear into the darkness above the channel. Some would distinguish themselves with incredible courage. Some would be killed before their parachutes hit French soil. All were flying into history aboard aircraft that might become their coffins. A little farther away, not having their supreme commander there to cheer them on in person, reconnaissance paratroopers came up with their own way to put on a brave face. Whether real Native Americans or just soldiers embracing the myth of the warrior, their scarlet war paint helped these 20-something men get ready for action. Those without war paint simply blackened their faces with charcoal so as to be less visible in the Norman darkness. The war paint served purposes beyond camouflage. It transformed scared young men into something primal and fierce. It created psychological armor against terror. Looking at their painted faces in mirrors and helmet reflections, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit became warriors preparing for the hunt. The paint was ritual. The paint was magic. The paint was survival. As well as their weapons and parachutes, these men would be jumping with radio transmitters to signal marked zones where gliders could drop the majority of troops. 3 men were needed to help 1 paratrooper on board, who had a 50% chance of survival, and who knew it. The weight of their equipment, radios, ammunition, medical supplies, emergency rations, threatened to drag them to the bottom of flooded Norman fields if their parachutes failed. But the most remarkable document of that night came not from the paratroopers themselves, but from their supreme commander. Alone in his quarters after watching the last transport disappear toward France, Eisenhower wrote a letter that revealed the depth of his personal anguish. It was a letter he prayed he would never need to send, a message to be released only if the landings ended in total disaster. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available, he wrote with careful, deliberate strokes. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Mine alone. 2 words that captured the awful solitude of supreme command. If 150,000 Allied soldiers died in the Channel surf, if the greatest amphibious invasion in history became the greatest military catastrophe in history, if Hitler's Atlantic Wall proved unbreachable and Europe remained enslaved, the responsibility would rest on one man's shoulders. Eisenhower sealed the letter and placed it in his desk drawer. Then he tried to sleep, knowing that in a few hours he would discover whether he was the general who liberated Europe or the commander who doomed the free world. Meanwhile, across the Channel, German sentries peered through the darkness toward England, unaware that the largest armada in human history was already moving through the night toward their coastline. Some dozed at their posts. Others played cards to pass the long hours until dawn. Most believed the storm would prevent any invasion attempt for days or even weeks. They had no idea that in a few hours their world would explode in fire and steel. For weeks, Allied forces had been perfecting a well-established plan. During the night of June 5th, German coastal defenses were to be wiped out by bombs. Naval artillery would start firing at dawn from 45 miles offshore. Everything depended on precise timing, overwhelming firepower, and the courage of young men stepping into landing craft in darkness. At 3:15 in the morning on June 6, 1944, Allied planes started bombing German positions across every sector of the planned landings. The longest day in the history of the 20th century had begun. At 3:15 a.m., the first bombs fell. But the real horror was about to unfold on a beach that would nearly destroy the American dream of victory. Dawn, June 6, 1944. From 45 miles offshore, Allied naval artillery began the bombardment that was supposed to smash Hitler's Atlantic Wall into rubble. For months, Allied planners had calculated the mathematics of destruction with scientific precision. Hundreds of heavy guns would pulverize German concrete. Thousands of bombs would crater defensive positions. By the time American boots touched Norman sand, enemy resistance would be scattered and broken. The plan was perfect. The execution was catastrophic. At dawn, Allied planes had started bombing German positions across every sector of the landings. But after arriving too soon or too late, many of the aerial bombardments missed their targets completely. Pilots, flying through storm clouds and anti-aircraft fire, released their payloads based on guesswork rather than precision. Tons of high explosives fell harmlessly into Norman fields and villages, killing French civilians instead of German defenders. The bombers that did find their targets faced an impossible problem. German bunkers had been built to withstand direct artillery hits, Reinforced concrete walls, 3 feet thick, absorbed bomb blasts that would have leveled city blocks. Rommel's engineers had designed these fortifications with one purpose: to survive exactly the kind of bombardment the Allies were delivering. Naval artillery didn't fare much better. The early hour of the landings, determined by tide calculations rather than tactical needs, didn't give the fleet enough time to successfully carry out its pulverization of German defenses. Warships firing from miles offshore struggled with range and accuracy. Gun crews, trained for naval battles against moving targets, found themselves trying to hit stationary concrete bunkers through morning mist and smoke. But the most devastating failure was one of simple geometry. Many German positions had been built into cliff faces and hidden behind natural terrain features that made them invisible from the sea. Naval gunners could see the beaches they were supposed to clear, but they couldn't see the machine gun nests that would soon slaughter American soldiers. They were firing blind at an enemy that remained hidden and intact. As landing craft approached the Norman coast, German defenders in concrete bunkers watched the approaching armada with professional satisfaction. Their communications were working. Their weapons were loaded and ready. Their fields of fire had been planned and rehearsed for months. The Atlantic Wall hadn't just survived the Allied bombardment. It was 100% intact and waiting. Omaha Beach, near the Cotentin Peninsula, was the Americans' first major objective. They would have to quickly establish a beachhead, then join up with their colleagues at Utah Beach before heading toward Cherbourg together. The plan called for rapid movement inland, securing the bluffs that overlooked the beach and opening supply routes for the massive buildup that would follow. Instead, they were sailing into the most perfectly prepared killing field in military history. The main part of the attack fell to the experienced GIs of the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division, veterans of North Africa and Sicily. These were hard men who had learned their trade fighting Rommel's Afrika Korps in the desert. They knew how to fight. They knew how to die. They knew how to win. But attached to them was the 116th Battalion, made up of young men who had never been in the line of fire. Farm boys from Virginia, factory workers from Pennsylvania, college students who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, 19 and 20-year-old Americans who had never seen combat, never heard bullets whistle past their ears, never watched friends die in front of them. In a few hours, those who survived would be veterans of the most brutal beach assault in American military history. To keep out of the range of enemy fire, the landing craft were released onto a rough sea too far from the coast. Men were crammed in like pack animals, seasick and terrified, listening to waves crash against steel hulls and wondering if they would live to see sunset. Some vomited from fear, others from seasickness, most from both. Strong currents that Allied planners had miscalculated swept the landing craft off course. Units trained to assault specific sectors of beach found themselves approaching completely different areas where their maps and intelligence were useless. Officers who had studied aerial photographs for months discovered they were leading their men toward terrain they had never seen before. The careful coordination that was supposed to make day a surgical operation was already dissolving into chaos before the first shot was fired. At 0630 hours, the first landing craft reached the beach. German machine gunners, who had been waiting patiently in their concrete bunkers, began to fire. What happened next would nearly destroy the American dream of victory and change the course of the entire war. And only one man with a camera would survive to document the horror. Robert Capa was not supposed to be the only photographer on Omaha Beach. Military planners had assigned multiple cameramen to document what they expected would be America's greatest triumph since the Revolutionary War. But storms, seasickness, and last-minute changes had left just one man with a camera facing the most important story of the 20th century. Capa was already a legend. His photographs from the Spanish Civil War had shown the world what modern warfare looked like through a lens. His images of the London Blitz had captured British courage under Nazi bombs. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was about to witness on a beach that would soon be painted red with American blood. Crammed into a landing craft with dozens of soldiers from the Big Red One, Capa felt the weight of impossible responsibility. His camera and film were the only means of showing the world what happened when democracy's sons stormed Hitler's fortress. If he failed, if his equipment was damaged, if he was killed before developing his photographs, history would lose its visual record of the most crucial day of the war. When the noise of the first shell hit our ears, Capa would later write, "We hit the deck and lay in our vomit without watching the coast approach." The smell of diesel fuel mixed with fear and sickness as the landing craft pitched through waves toward a beach none of them could yet see clearly. Soldiers who had been joking nervously a few minutes earlier now sat in grim silence, checking their weapons and trying not to think about what awaited them. Through the morning mist, the Norman coastline began to take shape. Cliffs rose above sandy beaches. Concrete bunkers squatted like grey toads among the dunes. And from those bunkers came flashes of light that Capa's experienced eye recognized immediately, muzzle flashes from machine guns that were already firing at approaching landing craft. The Atlantic Wall was awake and ready for its visitors. Barely on the beach, the men were greeted by an almost intact German defense. It was like a turkey shoot, except the Americans were the turkeys. Machine gun fire swept the sand in precise, overlapping patterns that German gunners had practiced for months. Mortar shells bracketed the landing craft with mathematical precision. Artillery pieces hidden in the bluffs above began dropping high explosive shells among clusters of American soldiers. Capa forced himself to raise his camera and begin shooting, even as bullets cracked through the air around him. His first photographs captured American soldiers in the most vulnerable moment of their lives, stumbling through surf, weighed down by equipment, completely exposed to enemy fire. Some fell immediately, their bodies disappearing beneath waves that had suddenly turned red. Others made it a few steps onto the beach before German bullets found them. The wind brought in the tide earlier than Allied forecasters had predicted. Following waves of attack floundered on Rommel's sea defenses, steel obstacles, and mines that had been designed specifically to destroy landing craft. Men were forced to leave their boats in deep water, their heavy equipment dragging them down like anchors. Some drowned before they could fire a shot. Others struggled through chest-deep surf, while machine guns cut them down. Unable to advance against the murderous fire from German positions, surviving Americans grouped together in the center of the beach. This was exactly what German gunners had hoped for: concentrated targets that couldn't move, couldn't escape, couldn't fight back effectively. From their protected bunkers, they poured fire into masses of American soldiers who had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Capper moved among them, somehow surviving the chaos while documenting America's darkest hour. His camera captured images that were almost too terrible to believe. Soldiers crouched behind the bodies of their dead comrades. Medics crawling through sand to reach wounded men, while bullets kicked up dirt around them. Officers trying to rally their troops, while German artillery turned the beach into a moonscape of craters and corpses. The sea itself seemed to rebel against the invasion. Waves that should have carried men safely to shore instead became instruments of death, washing bodies back and forth like driftwood. The pristine Norman beach that had looked so peaceful in reconnaissance photographs was now a hellscape where young Americans learned that war was nothing like the movies they had watched back home. Capper's most famous photograph from that day shows a soldier struggling through surf, his face obscured by spray and terror, his rifle held high to keep it dry. It is an image of pure human vulnerability, one man against the ocean, against German steel, against the machinery of industrial death. But what makes the photograph remarkable is not just what it shows, but what happened to it afterward. Most of Capper's photographs from Omaha Beach were accidentally destroyed in a London darkroom by an overeager technician who ruined the film while trying to develop it quickly for publication. History lost its visual record of America's bloodiest hour because someone was in too much of a hurry to be careful. Only a handful of images survived, and these few photographs became the entire visual legacy of the most important military operation in American history. But the images that survived were devastating enough. They showed the world that day was not a victory march, but a near disaster salvaged only by incredible courage and terrible sacrifice. They revealed that freedom's price was measured not in speeches and parades, but in young men dying on foreign beaches far from home. By mid-morning, the situation at Omaha Beach had become so desperate that American commanders faced a decision that could have changed the entire course of World War II. 10:30 a.m., June 6th, 1944. 6 hours after the first Americans had stumbled onto Omaha Beach, the situation had deteriorated from difficult to catastrophic to nearly impossible. Radio messages reaching Allied command ships offshore told the same story in increasingly desperate language. Nailed to the spot by enemy artillery. Unable to advance. Heavy casualties. Request immediate support. But the most chilling message was the one that didn't need to be sent in military code. American soldiers were dying faster than they could be replaced. The beach that was supposed to be secured in 2 hours remained firmly in German hands after 6. Units that should have been advancing inland were instead pinned down behind whatever cover they could find, unable to move forward and unable to retreat. The US command faced a decision that no American military leader had ever confronted. They considered calling off the entire offensive at Omaha Beach. Complete withdrawal, total abandonment of the operation that was supposed to liberate Western Europe. Admitting that Hitler's Atlantic Wall was unbreachable and that American military power had met its match on a Norman beach. The mathematics of disaster were undeniable. More than 3,000 Americans had already been killed or wounded on a stretch of sand less than 4 miles long. Entire companies had been wiped out in the first hour. Officers who should have been leading their men inland were dead in the surf. Equipment that should have been supporting the advance was scattered across the beach or sinking in the channel. But withdrawal would mean more than just tactical defeat. It would mean abandoning those Americans who had already landed to their fate, men who were still fighting, still dying, still hoping for reinforcement and support. There were already hundreds of dead and wounded lying on the beach. Their sacrifice would have been in vain if the operation was called off. Their deaths would become meaningless if America turned back at the moment of supreme test. More catastrophically, stopping the Omaha operation would open a huge breach in the Allied front just as the gigantic war machine was moving up to full throttle. British and Canadian forces were fighting their way inland from Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. American paratroopers were scattered across the Norman countryside, trying to secure key objectives. If Omaha failed, if the Americans couldn't establish their foothold, the entire invasion would collapse like a house of cards. German commanders, watching the slaughter from their concrete bunkers, began to believe they might actually defeat the Allied invasion. Radio reports to Berlin described American forces in full retreat, landing craft burning in the surf, bodies washing up on beaches like seaweed after a storm. For a few hours, it seemed possible that Hitler's boast about an impregnable Atlantic wall might actually prove true. The turning point came not from grand strategy or brilliant tactics, but from the accumulated courage of individual American soldiers who refused to accept defeat. Small groups of men began moving up the bluffs, not because they were ordered to, but because staying on the beach meant certain death. They crawled through minefields. They charged machine gun nests with nothing but rifles and grenades. They died by the dozens, but they kept moving forward, because forward was the only direction that offered hope. Gradually, painfully, at a cost that would haunt American families for generations, the tide began to turn. Individual acts of heroism accumulated into squad-level advances. Squad advances became company movements. Company movements began threatening German positions that had seemed invulnerable just hours earlier. The Atlantic Wall was strong, but it couldn't withstand the accumulated weight of American determination backed by American industrial might. By late afternoon, with the sun finally breaking through storm clouds, surviving American forces had managed to establish precarious footholds on the Norman bluffs above Omaha Beach. German resistance hadn't collapsed. It had been ground down by sheer persistence and overwhelming numbers. Every yard of ground had been paid for in American blood, but the payment had been made, and the advance continued. The Americans always did their best for their men, whatever extra backup was required. Even the first assault waves had been accompanied by an experienced medical corps ready to take immediate care of the wounded, including enemy prisoners. Never had first aid been so needed as at Bloody Omaha, where medics worked under fire to save lives on both sides of the battle. American soldiers, who had been trying to kill German defenders a few minutes earlier, now watched their own medics treating wounded Germans with the same care given to American casualties. More troops began arriving as the day progressed. Fresh units who could see the carnage on the beach but couldn't turn back, couldn't retreat, couldn't do anything except move forward and continue the fight their predecessors had started. The beach that had nearly witnessed the greatest American military disaster in history was slowly, painfully, becoming the foundation for ultimate victory. At last, as evening shadows lengthened across the Norman sand, it became possible to say that the landings at Omaha Beach had been a success. A success paid for with 3,000 American lives. A success that had come within hours of becoming a catastrophic failure. A success that would be remembered not for its tactical brilliance, but for the raw courage of young men who refused to quit when quitting would have been the reasonable choice. While Americans died at Omaha, just miles away, a 20-year-old British cameraman was about to film the moment that changed everything. Sword Beach, 06:45 hours. June 6th, 1944. While Americans died in their thousands at Omaha, just 20 miles to the west, a completely different story was unfolding on the Norman sand. Here, the Atlantic wall was cracking like an eggshell under Allied pressure. Here, young men were advancing inland instead of dying in the surf. Here, 20-year-old Sergeant Desmond O'Neill was about to capture the moment when Hitler's fortress began to crumble. O'Neill had arrived on Sword Beach 45 minutes before his fellow cameraman Ian Grant. While Grant was still struggling through seasickness and diesel fumes in his landing craft, O'Neill was already on French soil with his camera rolling. It was he who filmed the last moments of the battle for the beach and the first moments of French liberation. The British 3rd Infantry Division was heading for Sword Beach with a clear mission: neutralize the defences at Ouistreham, take the city of Caen the same day, open the road to Paris. The Scotsmen of the 45th Commando of the Royal Marines, filmed by their compatriot Sergeant Ian Grant, were among the units tasked with securing the beachhead and linking up with paratroopers who had been dropped behind German lines. But O'Neill was already there, moving through what he would later describe as an almost surreal battlefield. In the thick of that grey smoke, everything seemed unreal, he would remember decades later. It wasn't a battle that you could imagine or see in a movie. Real war, O'Neill discovered, was nothing like the Hollywood fantasies that had shaped his generation's understanding of combat. The exits from Sword Beach were congested with men and equipment, but they were moving. Unlike the horror unfolding at Omaha, here the Allied plan was actually working. It was nigh on impossible to get off the beach quickly, but it was possible. German resistance was fierce, but not overwhelming. Allied bombardment had actually damaged some enemy positions. Most importantly, German reinforcements were slow to arrive because Rommel's armoured divisions were still waiting for the real invasion at Calais. O'Neill followed an infantry platoon that was trying to push inland from the beach. His camera captured British soldiers moving through Norman villages, past stone houses and ancient churches, past French civilians who watched with a mixture of hope and terror as foreign armies fought on their doorsteps. Some villagers had hidden in cellars. Others peered through shuttered windows. A few brave souls ventured out to offer water or directions to the advancing Allied troops. The young sergeant's footage shows something remarkable, the moment when abstract concepts like liberation and freedom became concrete realities measured in yards of Norman soil. Every house taken from German control. Every crossroads secured by Allied forces. Every German prisoner marched to the rear. These were the building blocks of victory, captured frame by frame on O'Neill's film. But victory came with its own price, even on the beaches where everything went right. At this point in his filming, the jolting camera indicates that O'Neill had been shot. A German bullet or shell fragment had found him, even as he documented the successful advance of British forces. The camera shakes violently, then steadies as O'Neill, wounded and bleeding, continued to film. Professional dedication or youthful stubbornness, whatever motivated him, O'Neill kept his camera running even as his own blood stained the Norman sand. His final sequences show British troops moving past his position, advancing toward objectives that were now achievable rather than suicidal. He had just enough time to capture these last images before being evacuated for medical care. Farewell, Sergeant O'Neill, and well done to all your comrades who captured Sword Beach that day, at a cost of 600 dead and wounded. All lost in the mass of unknowns, most of whom were barely 20 years old. But unlike their countrymen dying at Omaha, these casualties had achieved their objectives. Sword Beach was in Allied hands. The road to Caen was open. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. German prisoners captured on Sword Beach were rounded up and marched toward collection points on the beach. Many looked relieved to be out of the fighting. Some appeared stunned by the speed of Allied success. Others maintained the disciplined bearing of professional soldiers who had fought well but been overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. For them, the war was over. For their French neighbors, a new chapter was just beginning. But the most remarkable story of day success was unfolding just a few miles away, where young men from the Canadian prairies were about to prove that sometimes the longest journeys end in the most unexpected places. What were these young soldiers thinking after making the 5,000-mile journey from peaceful Canadian prairies to land at Bernières, a small unknown seaside resort in Normandy? Farm boys from Saskatchewan, who had never seen an ocean, were now wading through channel surf under German machine gun fire. City boys from Toronto and Montreal, who had lived comfortable urban lives, were now carrying rifles through French villages their grandfathers might have left a generation earlier. Juno Beach had been assigned to Canadian forces under British command. Their mission was to take Carpiquet airfield near Caen, linking up with British forces advancing from Sword Beach to create a unified Allied front. 21,000 Canadians, the third largest Allied force participating in the invasion, carried the hopes of a nation that had been at war since 1939. The footage of their landing is remarkable for what it captured and how it was captured. This is film of the first wave of attack, the only such footage to be recorded during the day landings. But it wasn't filmed by a human cameraman. An automatic camera had been fixed to the landing craft, creating a mechanical eye that recorded history without emotion, without fear, without the human trembling that affected handheld cameras in combat. Yet even the cold eye of a mechanical camera couldn't fail to capture simple human gestures. A soldier helping a wounded comrade, a Canadian flag being planted in Norman sand, the first tentative waves from French civilians who weren't sure if these foreign soldiers were liberators or just another occupying army. The machine recorded what human eyes might have missed in the chaos, moments of connection between strangers, united by the simple desire to survive and succeed. Soon, the very first French house would be liberated in Normandy. But it would cost the lives of 100 Allied soldiers, a terrible price for a single building. Allied cameramen had been specifically asked not to film the casualties, the price paid for each yard of French soil. It was better to focus on German prisoners and the anger that one proud Frenchman showed toward his former occupiers. The German surrender on Juno Beach did nothing to mask the difficulties faced by Canadian forces. A rough sea was causing serious problems for the second assault wave's landing. Landing craft struggled against waves that were higher and more violent than forecasters had predicted. Equipment was lost overboard. Men arrived on the beach exhausted from fighting seasickness and terrified by the sound of gunfire that grew louder as they approached the Norman coast. A total of 300 young Canadians lost their lives at Juno Beach. 300 families in Halifax and Winnipeg and Vancouver would receive telegrams informing them that their sons had died for French freedom. But the sacrifice wasn't in vain. With the beachhead established, their surviving colleagues began their advance inland towards Sarn and toward the victory that their fallen comrades had made possible. Already, the first reward came in the shape of young French women delighted at seeing their country liberated by these men, many of whom spoke French, albeit with funny accents that mixed Quebecois pronunciation with prairie drawls. Bonjour, mes amis. Merci beaucoup. Vive le Canada. The sound of French voices welcoming Canadian soldiers created a bridge across an ocean, connecting the battlefields of Normandy with the peaceful farms and cities these young men had left behind. For many Canadians, this was their first encounter with the people they were fighting to liberate. France had been an abstract concept back home, something in geography, textbooks, and newspaper headlines. But here were real French families, emerging from hiding places to offer food and water to foreign soldiers who had traveled half the world to restore their freedom. Children who spoke no English, but understood the universal language of liberation. Elderly men and women who remembered the previous war and couldn't believe they were living through another German occupation. The Canadians had proven something important on Juno Beach. Small nations could play decisive roles in great events. Citizens of peaceful democracies could fight as fiercely as professional soldiers when the cause was just. And sometimes, the longest journeys, 5,000 miles from Canadian prairies to Norman beaches, led to the most meaningful destinations. But while British and Canadian forces were advancing successfully on the eastern flank of the invasion, American paratroopers scattered across the western flank were turning military disaster into unexpected victory. The American airborne assault on Day was supposed to be a precision operation. Paratroopers would land in designated drop zones behind German lines. They would secure key bridges and crossroads. They would link up with forces advancing inland from Utah Beach. Everything would proceed according to plan. Instead, it became the most successful military disaster in American history. American airborne troops had lost over half their equipment and 1 in 5 of their men during the confused night drops. Paratroopers, who were supposed to land together, found themselves scattered across dozens of miles of Norman countryside. Units that should have been fighting as coordinated battalions were instead operating as isolated squads, with no communication and no clear idea of where they were. Officers trained to lead companies found themselves commanding handfuls of soldiers from different divisions. By every measure of military planning, the American airborne operation was a catastrophic failure. But by the standards of practical results, it was a brilliant success. Often dropping at imprecise locations, the scattered paratroopers had been unable to link up with their planned units. But their wide dispersion across the Norman landscape created exactly the kind of confusion that military strategists dream about, confusion that hurt the enemy more than it hurt the attackers. German commanders, trying to make sense of reports flooding in from across their defensive sector, couldn't determine where the main American assault was coming from. Radio reports to German headquarters described American paratroopers everywhere. Small groups attacking bridges near Sainte-Mère, Église. Other units cutting telephone lines east of Carentan. Still more Americans spotted near Bayeux, far from any planned drop zone. To German intelligence officers plotting these reports on their maps, it looked like the Americans had dropped far more paratroopers than actually existed. The over-wide dispersion of American airborne forces managed to keep the Germans confused, making them believe that a far greater number of men had been dropped than in reality. A few thousand scattered paratroopers created the impression of a massive airborne invasion. German reserves that should have been rushing to defend Utah Beach were instead chasing ghosts across the Norman countryside. Reinforcements that might have turned the tide at critical moments were tied down fighting isolated American squads who seemed to be everywhere at once. Many paratroopers were recaptured after their scattered landings, but few seemed resigned to their fate. American soldiers who had volunteered for the most dangerous mission of the invasion weren't about to surrender easily. Some escaped from German custody and continued fighting as irregular forces behind enemy lines. Others used their time as prisoners to gather intelligence about German positions and troop movements. Even in captivity, they continued to contribute to the Allied war effort. Meanwhile, the landing at Utah Beach itself proceeded with remarkable success. Unlike the horror at Omaha, American forces here found German defenses that had been softened by the confusion created by scattered paratroopers. Enemy units that should have been defending the beach were instead searching for American airborne troops in villages miles inland. Communication lines that should have been coordinating German resistance had been cut by paratroopers who might not have known exactly where they were, but knew how to disrupt enemy operations. The success at Utah Beach validated a principle that military theorists still study today. Sometimes, chaos works better than coordination. Sometimes, confusion in your own ranks creates even more confusion in enemy ranks. The American paratroopers, who had failed to achieve their specific objectives, had succeeded in achieving something more valuable. They had created the conditions for overall victory. As Utah Beach was secured and American forces began advancing inland, they started linking up with the scattered paratroopers who had been fighting behind German lines all day. These reunions were emotional and practical. Isolated airborne units finally had heavy weapons and supply lines. Beach forces finally had guides who knew the local terrain and enemy positions. What had started as a military disaster was turning into a coordinated advance. All these men had paid dearly for the honor of being the first to tread on French soil. But they had achieved something remarkable. They had proven that American military doctrine could adapt to unexpected circumstances. They had shown that individual initiative could compensate for failed coordination. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that sometimes the best battle plan is the ability to abandon your battle plan when reality demands improvisation. But the most moving moment of day success was about to unfold in a single French house, where the abstract concept of liberation would become concrete reality. The building was nothing special. A Norman farmhouse built of local stone, with a slate roof and small windows that had watched over French fields for perhaps 2 centuries. Under German occupation, it had been just another piece of property in Hitler's European empire. But on June 6, 1944, this anonymous house would become the first piece of France to be truly free. Allied cameramen captured the moment when British soldiers approached the building, not knowing if German defenders were waiting inside. The footage shows the careful advance of men who had learned that liberation was won one house at a time, one room at a time, one life at a time. This wasn't the sweeping advance across open country that military planners had envisioned. This was the reality of warfare in occupied territory, slow, careful, deadly. 100 Allied lives would be lost in the fighting around this single building. 100 families in Britain and Canada would lose sons, husbands, fathers, for the sake of liberating one French farmhouse. The mathematics seem impossible to justify until you understand what that house represented. It wasn't just a building. It was the first crack in Hitler's European fortress. It was proof that the Atlantic Wall could be broken. It was hope made concrete. The first French family to be liberated emerged from their cellar with expressions that cameras could capture, but words could never adequately describe. Relief, joy, disbelief, terror that it might all be temporary. They had lived under German occupation for 4 years, watching foreign soldiers patrol their streets, hearing foreign voices give orders in their own country. Now other foreign soldiers, but these spoke English and carried different flags, were telling them they were free. The moment was captured on film, but Allied cameramen had been specifically instructed not to focus on the cost, the 100 Allied casualties that made this liberation possible. Instead, they filmed German prisoners being marched toward collection points. But one sequence shows something remarkable: the anger that a proud Frenchman displayed toward his former occupiers. 4 years of suppressed rage erupting in a torrent of French words that needed no translation. Humiliation and collaboration and resistance all mixed together in one man's fury at the soldiers who had stolen his country's freedom. The German prisoners in that footage look stunned, not just by their capture, but by the intensity of French hatred they were encountering for the first time. Many German soldiers had convinced themselves that they were protecting Europe from Bolshevism, that their occupation was a civilizing mission, that French civilians appreciated German order and efficiency. The reality, the raw fury of people who had endured 4 years of foreign domination, was a shock that no amount of Nazi propaganda had prepared them for. But the liberation of that first French house also revealed something about the nature of freedom that abstract political theory never captures. Freedom isn't just the absence of occupation. Freedom is French voices speaking French words in French houses without fear. Freedom is children running in streets where they don't have to step aside for foreign soldiers. Freedom is the right to be angry at your oppressors, to show that anger openly, to demand justice for years of humiliation. The footage of that first liberated house became symbolic of everything Day was meant to achieve. One family, one building, one small piece of Europe restored to freedom. Multiplied by thousands of houses, tens of thousands of families, entire nations waiting for liberation. The mathematics of freedom calculated not in abstract principles but in concrete human experiences. Yet at Allied headquarters in Portsmouth, despite British Admiral Ramsay smiling with pride at the part played by his fleet, General Eisenhower still seemed anxious. Since dawn, he had been receiving message after message, some alarming like those from Omaha, some encouraging like those from Utah and the British sector. From the look on Ike's face, you could tell that the battle hadn't yet been won. Because 6 hours after landing at Omaha, American boys were still stuck at the foot of the cliffs. Because German reinforcements were finally beginning to move toward the invasion beaches. Because the hardest fighting lay ahead, not behind. Day had been a success, but day was just the beginning. Victory seemed certain, but Eisenhower's face told a different story. Because across the Channel, Germany's most brilliant general was about to make his fatal mistake. While Allied forces were establishing their foothold in Normandy, a deadly argument was unfolding in German headquarters that would determine the fate of the Third Reich. It was a strategic fight between two of Germany's most experienced generals, and their disagreement would cost Hitler the war. The Desert Fox faced off against the Old Prussian in a battle that was fought with words rather than weapons, but whose outcome would be measured in millions of lives. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, hero of the African campaign, champion of aggressive tactics, believer in striking fast and striking hard, versus Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, veteran of the First World War, master of traditional German military doctrine, architect of the Blitzkrieg victories that had conquered Poland and France. Hitler was far from operations in his eastern headquarters, close to the Soviet front, where he still continued to divide in order to rule. In the west, he had split the German command between Marshal von Rundstedt, chief of the Western Front, and Marshal Rommel, chief of coastal defense. It was a decision that would prove catastrophic because these two brilliant generals disagreed completely about how to defeat the Allied invasion. Von Rundstedt represented the old school of German military thinking. Keep the armored divisions inland, away from Allied naval bombardment and air attacks. Let the enemy land and establish beachheads. Then, when their positions were clear and their intentions obvious, converge overwhelming German armor on precise zones to crush the invasion. It was methodical. It was traditional. It would have worked brilliantly in 1940 against a demoralized French army. But Rommel understood something that von Rundstedt refused to acknowledge. This wasn't 1940. The Allies now controlled the skies over Western Europe. British and American aviation would paralyze German troop movements the moment tanks tried to move in daylight. Roads would become killing zones. Supply columns would be sitting ducks. Reinforcements would never reach the battle because they would be destroyed en route. Rommel therefore wanted to bring the armored divisions as close as possible to the coast to confront the enemy as they were landing. Hit them in the water. Hit them on the beaches. Hit them before they could establish the air superiority and logistical bases that would make them unbeatable. We must stop them at the water's edge, Rommel argued in heated conferences. If they gain a foothold, we lose the war. However, his wishes were rejected. Von Rundstedt's influence with Hitler, his reputation as the architect of victory in France, his status as a Prussian military aristocrat, All of these factors weighed against Rommel's tactical innovations. The High Command chose tradition over adaptation, theory over battlefield experience, the strategy that had worked in the past over the strategy that might work in the present. But Hitler, characteristically, refused to choose definitively between his two field marshals. Instead, he made the worst possible decision. He tried to satisfy both generals by adopting neither strategy completely. Some armoured divisions stayed inland where von Rundstedt wanted them. Some moved closer to the coast as Rommel demanded. The result was a compromise that pleased no one and protected nothing. German tank units found themselves scattered across northern France in positions that were neither fully inland nor fully coastal. They were too close to the shore to avoid Allied naval bombardment. They were too far from the beaches to intervene effectively during the critical first hours of the invasion. When day came, these armoured divisions would arrive at the battle too late and in too small numbers to change the outcome. The tragedy was compounded by Hitler's micromanagement from his distant headquarters. The Führer insisted that no major troop movements could occur without his personal authorization. But Hitler was a night owl who often slept until noon, and his staff was too terrified to wake him with urgent military reports. On the morning of June 6th, when immediate action might have made the difference, German armour sat motionless for hours, while their supreme commander enjoyed his beauty sleep. By the time Hitler was awake and alert enough to authorize counterattacks, Allied forces had already established themselves on Norman soil. The moment of maximum vulnerability, those crucial first hours when the invasion could have been defeated, had passed while German commanders waited for permission to move their own troops. Military initiative had been sacrificed to political control, and the price was the loss of Western Europe. Rommel had been proved right in the most costly way possible. The Allied invasion could only be defeated at the water's edge, in the first few hours, before superior numbers and firepower could establish themselves. Once the Allies gained their footholds, once they brought their massive logistical capabilities to bear, once their air forces dominated the Norman skies, German defeat was inevitable. The strategic argument between Rommel and von Rundstedt hadn't just been about military tactics, it had been about the survival of Nazi Germany. And Hitler's refusal to choose had chosen defeat. But even as their strategic situation became hopeless, some German units were preparing to fight with a fanatical intensity that would shock even veteran Allied forces. Two armoured divisions, including the famous 12th Panzer Hitlerjugend SS, counterattacked on June 7th, 8th and 9th, barring the road to Caen to the British and Canadians. But this wasn't ordinary German resistance. These weren't veteran soldiers fighting for their country. These were teenagers fighting for their faith. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth represented everything that was both tragic and terrifying about Nazi Germany's final phase. Boys who should have been finishing school were instead manning Tiger tanks. 17 and 18-year-old Germans, who had never known life without Nazi propaganda, were now dying for Hitler's vision of racial supremacy. They fought with the fanatical courage of true believers and the tactical skill of soldiers trained from childhood for this moment. These young Germans had been raised in a system that taught them death was preferable to defeat. Surrender was treason. Retreat was cowardice. The only honourable options were victory or death, and since victory was no longer possible, death became a sacrament. Allied soldiers, who expected demoralized Germans ready to surrender, instead encountered fanatical resistance from boys who preferred martyrdom to survival. The Hitler Youth Division established defensive positions outside Caen and refused to budge. When British tanks advanced, teenage anti-tank crews held their positions until the last possible moment, firing at point-blank range before being crushed by Allied armor. When infantry assaults threatened their lines, these boy soldiers counterattacked with grenades and bayonets, dying in numbers that shocked hardened British veterans. Allied commanders found themselves fighting an enemy that didn't behave according to normal military logic. Professional soldiers understand when a position is hopeless and act accordingly. They retreat to fight another day. They surrender when resistance becomes suicidal. They preserve their forces for battles they might actually win. But the Hitler Youth had been programmed differently. They had been taught that dying for Hitler was the highest honor a German could achieve. The result was resistance that was both tactically effective and strategically pointless. These teenage fanatics could hold ground temporarily, but they couldn't change the overall course of the battle. They could inflict casualties on Allied forces, but they couldn't prevent the ultimate German defeat. They died courageously for a cause that was already lost, sacrificing their lives for a regime that had sacrificed their childhood to its twisted ideology. British and Canadian forces found the fighting around Caen more difficult than expected, not because of superior German strategy, but because of fanatical German resistance. Progress that should have taken hours instead took days. Objectives that should have cost dozens of casualties instead cost hundreds. Montgomery's plan to capture Caen on day itself became impossible when confronted with teenage soldiers who preferred death to defeat. The tragedy extended beyond the battlefield. German propaganda crews filmed these boy soldiers in combat, creating footage that was meant to inspire German resistance, but instead documented the final corruption of Nazi Germany. The regime that claimed to be building a 1,000-year Reich was sending children to die for its survival. The master race was sacrificing its own future to preserve its present. The propaganda films showed German courage, but they also revealed German desperation. Even more tragically, German propaganda also filmed the suffering of these teenage soldiers, when Allied bombing made no distinction between fanatical Hitler Youth and ordinary German civilians. The cameras captured boy soldiers wounded by Allied artillery, dying in Norman hospitals, writing final letters to parents they would never see again. The propaganda value was obvious. Look how the Allies murdered German children. But the deeper truth was more disturbing. Look how the Nazi regime murders German children by sending them to war. The Hitler Youth Division's resistance around Caen achieved its immediate tactical objectives. They set up their defenses outside the city and held them against repeated Allied assaults. They barred the road to Caen and kept it barred for weeks. They proved that fanatical resistance could delay superior forces even when victory was impossible. But they also proved something more tragic, that political fanaticism could transform ordinary teenagers into willing sacrifices for a lost cause. When the Hitler Youth Division was finally destroyed, when its boy soldiers were finally killed or captured, when Caen was finally taken by Allied forces, the tactical situation hadn't fundamentally changed. The German strategic position was still hopeless. Allied superiority was still overwhelming. Nazi defeat was still inevitable. All that had changed was that hundreds of German teenagers had died for nothing more than a few weeks' delay in the inevitable. But the final judgment on Hitler's strategy would come from one of Germany's most experienced field marshals in a document that revealed the depth of German military despair. After Cherbourg fell to American forces, Hitler decided to personally oversee the German army in the West. He removed von Rundstedt, who had committed the unforgivable sin of suggesting that Germany should call a truce with the Allies. In his place, the Führer appointed a more obliging field marshal, Günther von Kluge, a man who would learn too late that loyalty to Hitler was a form of suicide. Von Kluge arrived in Normandy with Hitler's orders ringing in his ears. Hold every inch of ground. Launch immediate counterattacks. Drive the invaders back into the sea. Prove that German will was stronger than Allied material superiority. The new field marshal was a competent professional soldier who understood military reality. But he also understood that contradicting Hitler's fantasy was a career-ending move. Meanwhile, Rommel, dismayed by the Führer's hardline policies, knew that all he could do now was to delay the ultimate disaster. The Desert Fox had seen the future with crystal clarity. German forces in Normandy were trapped between Allied naval power offshore and Allied air power overhead. Supply lines were being systematically destroyed. Reinforcements couldn't reach the front. Ammunition was running low. Fuel was scarce. The German army was slowly being strangled by superior Allied logistics. But Hitler demanded offensive action. At dawn, the Germans tried a last throw of the dice. From the plain of Caen, they launched a counter-offensive on Mortain, hoping to drive the Allies back to the sea. The attack had been planned personally by Hitler from his distant headquarters, designed by a man who understood political propaganda better than military reality. Von Kluge knew the attack was doomed before it began. German tanks moving in daylight would be sitting ducks for Allied fighter bombers. German supply lines were already severed. German reserves had been committed piecemeal in previous battles. This wasn't a strategic masterstroke. It was a suicide mission designed to satisfy Hitler's need for aggressive action, regardless of practical consequences. The attack was soon curbed by rockets launched from the Allies' Typhoon fighter bombers. German armor that might have been preserved for defensive battles was instead destroyed in hopeless offensive operations. Experienced crews who represented years of training and combat experience were killed, attacking positions they couldn't possibly capture. The cream of the German armored forces was sacrificed to Hitler's refusal to accept military reality. It had no chance of success, von Kluge would write in his final assessment of the Mortain offensive. Those 7 words contained the entire tragedy of German strategy in Normandy. Military operations launched not because they could succeed, but because Hitler demanded action. Soldiers' lives spent not to achieve victory, but to maintain the Führer's illusions. A professional army destroyed by amateur political interference. The Mortain attack would be the last German offensive in the West. After it failed, after German reserves were exhausted, after the Atlantic Wall finally crumbled completely, even the most loyal Nazi generals couldn't pretend that victory was possible. The only questions remaining were how long German resistance could continue, and how many soldiers would die defending a regime that had already lost the war. Von Kluge understood that he faced an impossible choice. Continue following Hitler's orders and watch the German army be destroyed in pointless battles, or disobey Hitler's orders and face execution as a traitor. For a professional soldier trained in Prussian traditions of duty and honor, neither option was acceptable. Loyalty demanded obedience to the Führer. Professional competence demanded military reality. The contradiction was unsolvable. Before taking his own life, von Kluge wrote a letter that served as both confession and condemnation. He admitted that German strategy in Normandy had been fatally flawed from the beginning. He acknowledged that Hitler's interference had made military success impossible. He recognized that continuing the war would only increase German casualties without changing the ultimate outcome. And he chose death over the dishonor of presiding over his army's destruction. It was the final judgment of a field marshal on his Führer's military leadership. Professional soldiers could see what political fanatics refused to acknowledge. The war was lost. The cause was hopeless. The only rational choice was surrender. But rationality had no place in Hitler's Reich, and von Kluge chose suicide over the impossible task of implementing irrational orders with a rational mind. His death symbolized the bankruptcy of German military leadership under Nazi political control. The finest generals in the world couldn't win battles when their strategies were dictated by ideological fantasy rather than tactical reality. Von Kluge's suicide note became the epitaph of the German army in Normandy, destroyed not by enemy action alone, but by the impossible contradictions of serving a regime that valued political loyalty over military competence. But as German resistance crumbled, a new battle was brewing, not against Hitler, but between the Allied leaders themselves. General Montgomery arrived in Normandy 2 days after day, and he had cause for serious concern. But not the kind of concern that military historians usually discuss. Monty's problem wasn't German resistance or tactical difficulties or logistical challenges. His problem was that other generals were getting too much attention. Always wanting to have a crushing balance of power in his favor before taking action, Montgomery delayed deploying his armored divisions and was unable to take Cannes as he was supposed to have done on day 1. The city that should have fallen on June 6th was still in German hands a week later, then 2 weeks later, then a month later. Each day of delay gave German forces more time to strengthen their defenses and bring up reinforcements. But Montgomery had explanations for everything. German resistance was unexpectedly fierce. The Hitler Youth SS division was fighting with fanatical determination. Weather conditions were unfavorable for armored operations. Air support was insufficient. Every excuse was technically accurate, but none addressed the fundamental problem. Montgomery was more concerned with avoiding failure than achieving success. Moreover, his troops, relieved at having been able to land without too much damage, seemed to have a lack of bite. British soldiers who had fought courageously on the beaches now showed a curious reluctance to push inland aggressively. Their cameramen embodied this attitude, strolling around filming French civilians instead of documenting military advances. The urgency of day was giving way to the comfortable pace of occupation duty. Montgomery's leadership style contributed to this loss of momentum. As always aware of cameras, he seemed more interested in staging photo opportunities than planning military operations. Norman Johnson, his personal cameraman, was given the task of documenting Montgomery's every move, creating a visual record of British command competence. But the cameras captured something unintended, a general more concerned with his image than his mission. Eisenhower's frustration with Montgomery grew with each passing day. The Supreme Allied commander had planned for Kane to be the hinge of the entire Normandy campaign. British forces were supposed to capture the city quickly, then use its road network to threaten German positions across the entire front. American forces could then break out of their beachhead, knowing that German reserves were tied down defending against British advances. Instead, Montgomery's delay at Caen was affecting the entire Allied strategy. German armoured divisions that should have been defending against British attacks were instead being moved to face American forces. The careful coordination that made day possible was breaking down because one commander refused to take the risks necessary for victory. Eisenhower found himself fighting two wars, one against the Germans and one against his own subordinate's ego. The breaking point came during a heated conference where Montgomery tried to explain why Caen remained in German hands weeks after it should have been liberated. His explanation was characteristically elaborate and technically sophisticated. German defensive positions were stronger than intelligence had suggested. Enemy morale was higher than expected. Allied casualties would be unacceptably heavy if British forces attacked prematurely. Eisenhower's response was blunt and devastating. "Monty, we didn't come here to avoid casualties. We came here to win a war." The Supreme Allied commander understood something that Montgomery seemed to have forgotten. Military success required accepting military risks. Playing it safe was often the most dangerous strategy of all. Montgomery finally decided to employ considerable means to capture Caen. He asked for backup from the Royal Air Force. Over 2,500 tons of bombs were dropped on the city in a bombardment that was supposed to clear the way for British ground forces. The attack was massive, destructive, and ultimately counterproductive. After 2 days of fierce combat, 115,000 British troops entered the east of the city, which was now 3/4 destroyed. On July 13th, Montgomery finally arrived in Seine to claim his victory. It had taken him over a month to capture only part of a city he had hoped to take in one day. The delay had given German forces time to establish new defensive lines. The bombing had destroyed French homes and killed French civilians. The victory felt more like a defeat. Clearly, in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Although French inhabitants raised the flag of the Cross of Lorraine when British forces finally arrived, much of the city was still in German hands. Montgomery's triumph was incomplete, belated, and Pyrrhic. But that didn't prevent the British propaganda machine from presenting it as a great success. The cameras showed British troops and Caen inhabitants drinking toasts together in scenes that looked more like a peacetime celebration than a wartime liberation. "Goodbye, thanks again," British soldiers said to French civilians. "Don't mention it. Pleasure was all mine," came the polite replies. But the forced joviality couldn't hide the underlying truth. Montgomery's ego had cost Allied forces weeks of precious time and thousands of unnecessary casualties. Eisenhower placed more and more trust in the discreet three-star general, Omar Bradley, who had organized the landings at Omaha and Utah before taking Cherbourg. Bradley's calm, clear-headedness and effectiveness stood in sharp contrast to Montgomery's theatrical posturing. The Supreme Allied commander was learning a painful lesson about coalition warfare. Sometimes your allies cause more problems than your enemies. But Montgomery's ego problems were trivial compared to the political earthquake that was approaching from across the Channel. Charles de Gaulle was coming to claim France, and he had no intention of asking permission from anyone. Charles de Gaulle had never liked being in need of help, and stepping onto French soil at Corso after 4 years of exile was no exception. The tall, austere general who had defied Churchill, antagonized Roosevelt, and challenged Stalin was finally returning to reclaim his homeland. But he wasn't coming as a grateful subordinate to his allied liberators. He was coming as the rightful leader of France, and he intended to make that clear to everyone. The day before de Gaulle's arrival, Churchill had written to Montgomery with characteristic British understatement. "I must inflict on you a visit from General de Gaulle." The Prime Minister's choice of the word inflict revealed everything about the relationship between the Free French leader and his supposed allies. De Gaulle wasn't seen as a partner in liberation. He was seen as a political problem that had to be managed. Churchill's instructions to Montgomery were deliberately dismissive. "I do not think you should greet him on the beach," the Prime Minister wrote. "It would be sufficient for him to arrive at your headquarters." The message was clear. Treat de Gaulle politely, but not as an equal. Show him the courtesy due to a minor ally, but don't give him the ceremonial recognition he craved as France's legitimate ruler. But de Gaulle had spent 4 years in London learning how to outmaneuver British politicians who underestimated his determination. He understood that symbols mattered more than substance in politics. The general who stepped onto Norman sand wasn't just returning from exile, he was claiming France by right of presence. Every photograph, every handshake, every public appearance would establish his authority over French soil and French people. De Gaulle would only spend 1 day in France during this initial visit. For him, time was pressing. Time to tell Montgomery what he wanted to hear. Time to establish his credentials as France's leader. Time to demonstrate that the liberation of France would be a French achievement, not just an Allied gift. The British Field Marshal even let him hog the limelight, perhaps understanding that cooperation was preferable to confrontation. Montgomery gave Norman Johnson, his personal cameraman, the task of following de Gaulle throughout his visit. Officially, this was to document the historic moment of French liberation. Unofficially, it was probably to keep an eye on a political leader whom Churchill and Roosevelt distrusted. Johnson found de Gaulle a compelling subject for his camera. "It was hard to follow him," Johnson said later, "but luckily he was tall." De Gaulle's height wasn't just a physical advantage, it was a political metaphor. He always had the same serious expression on his face, projecting an image of unshakable authority. He always ignored cameras, or at least pretended to, creating an impression of natural leadership rather than manufactured publicity. As Johnson observed, de Gaulle was a star in the making who understood instinctively how to use media attention to build political power. The real test came in Bayeux, where French civilians encountered their returning leader for the first time since 1940. People everywhere were delighted to finally see Frenchmen who weren't under the German yoke. The crowds that gathered weren't just celebrating liberation from Nazi occupation, they were celebrating the restoration of French sovereignty. De Gaulle represented continuity with the France that had existed before Hitler, hope for the France that would exist after victory. De Gaulle was intent on showing himself off with his own people and the men and women of the resistance, with no British or Americans present. This wasn't accidental, it was a calculated political statement. France's future would be determined by French people, not by foreign generals or foreign politicians. Liberation was welcome, but independence was not negotiable. The climax came at Bayeux's town hall, where de Gaulle installed his own representatives without referring to the Allies. He denied Allied commanders any say in France's political choices and forced them to recognize his power in the country. It was a masterful political coup executed under the noses of his supposed liberators. While British and American forces were still fighting German resistance, de Gaulle was already governing liberated territory. The Allied reaction was a mixture of admiration and exasperation. Roosevelt had hoped to install American military governors in liberated French territory, treating France as occupied enemy territory rather than as a liberated ally. Churchill had expected French gratitude and French subordination to British leadership. Both leaders discovered that Charles de Gaulle had his own ideas about French sovereignty. De Gaulle's political maneuvering revealed something crucial about the nature of the Allied coalition. The partnership that had made Day possible was held together by shared enemies rather than shared values. Once German resistance began to crumble, once victory became inevitable, the underlying tensions between democratic allies would become more apparent. Liberation was easier to achieve than cooperation. The French general's brief visit to Normandy established principles that would shape post-war Europe. Small nations would not be grateful clients of great powers. Liberation would not mean subordination. Democracy would not be imposed from outside, it would be reclaimed from within. De Gaulle's day in France was short, but its political consequences would last for decades. Eisenhower, watching this political theater unfold while trying to fight a war, understood that military victory was only the beginning of Allied challenges. Defeating Hitler would be simpler than managing the peace that followed. The coalition that had liberated Europe would spend the next 50 years learning how to live with the consequences of its own success. But before political arguments could be resolved, military arguments had to be settled. And the most bitter argument of all involved the price that French civilians paid for their own liberation. The bombs fell on French towns and villages with mathematical precision, but their targets weren't always military. Allied planes attacked northern and western France to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. But in the process, they also attacked French civilians who had spent 4 years waiting for liberation, only to discover that freedom came at the cost of their own destruction. Allied bombers were unparticular about their targets. They struck Lower Normandy for 3 full days, claiming almost 4,000 German and civilian lives. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. Every German soldier killed by Allied bombs came at the cost of French civilians killed in the same attacks. Liberation required destruction, and destruction didn't discriminate between friends and enemies. The bombing raids led to heated discussions between Eisenhower and Churchill that revealed fundamental differences in how they viewed the moral costs of military victory. The British Prime Minister was concerned about the weight of hatred Allied attacks would cause among the French people. How could Britain claim to be liberating France if British bombs were killing French families? How could the Allies present themselves as moral alternatives to Nazi occupation if they were also destroying French towns? Churchill's argument was both practical and ethical. Practically, the Allies needed French cooperation to make the liberation successful. French resistance fighters provided intelligence. French civilians could offer or withhold local knowledge. French infrastructure would be essential for Allied logistics. If bombing campaigns turned the French population against their liberators, military victory might become political defeat. Ethically, Churchill struggled with the moral implications of killing innocent people to achieve noble goals. The Prime Minister, who had led Britain through the Blitz, understood what civilian bombing meant from the receiving end. British families had experienced German bombs falling on London neighbourhoods. British children had died in air raids that targeted civilian morale rather than military objectives. Could Britain now justify doing to French families what Germany had done to British families? Eisenhower's position was coldly strategic. Military necessity trumped moral squeamishness. German reinforcements had to be prevented from reaching Normandy, regardless of civilian casualties. Allied soldiers' lives took precedence over French civilians' lives. Victory required hard choices, and those hard choices included accepting that innocent people would die for the greater good. The Supreme Allied Commander's argument was mathematically compelling. Every German division delayed by bombing campaigns meant fewer Allied casualties on Norman beaches. Every bridge destroyed by Allied air power meant German reinforcements arriving too late to be effective. Every French life lost to Allied bombs might save multiple British and American lives in ground combat. The arithmetic of war was brutal, but it was also logical. To the surprise of both Allied leaders, the French resistance movement provided an unexpected answer to this moral dilemma. When asked about civilian casualties from Allied bombing, French underground leaders gave a response that was both heartbreaking and heroic. "This is war," they said. "We must accept people will die." French resistance fighters understood the costs of liberation better than their liberators did. They had watched German occupation destroy French lives for 4 years. They had seen friends executed, families deported, communities terrorized by Nazi brutality. They knew that freedom always came at a price, and they were willing to pay that price even when it included their own civilian casualties. The French response revealed something profound about the nature of resistance to tyranny. People who had lived under Nazi occupation understood that some things were worth dying for. French civilians who were killed by Allied bombs were casualties of war, but French civilians who lived under German rule were casualties of something worse: the systematic destruction of human dignity. Liberation was worth its costs because occupation was unbearable. 4,000 French civilians died from Allied bombing during the Normandy campaign. 4,000 families lost loved ones to their own liberators' weapons. 4,000 funerals held for people who died not from German cruelty but from Allied military necessity. Each death was a tragedy. Each funeral was a reminder that war corrupts even noble causes. But the bombing campaigns achieved their military objectives. German reinforcements were delayed, disrupted, and destroyed before they could reach the Normandy battlefields. Communication lines were severed, preventing German commanders from coordinating their defense effectively. Supply lines were interrupted, leaving German forces without ammunition, fuel, and food. The strategic bombing that killed French civilians also killed the German capacity to resist Allied advances. The moral complexity of this achievement would haunt Allied leaders for the rest of their lives. Victory had been purchased with innocent blood. Liberation had required destruction. Noble ends had demanded ignoble means. The French resistance had given permission for their own civilians to be sacrificed, but that permission didn't eliminate the moral weight of those sacrifices. Years later, when historians studied the Allied bombing campaigns, they would debate whether civilian casualties were truly necessary for military success. Some argued that more precise targeting could have achieved the same strategic results with fewer civilian deaths. Others maintained that the technology and intelligence of 1944 made civilian casualties inevitable. But the debate missed the fundamental point. War had forced decent people to make indecent choices. The 4,000 French civilians killed by Allied bombs joined the millions of other casualties whose deaths made victory possible. Their sacrifice was honored by liberation, but their loss couldn't be justified by success. They died so that France could be free, but their deaths also proved that freedom's price was sometimes paid by people who never chose to pay it. While leaders fought over politics and ethics, while they debated civilian casualties and military necessity, nature itself was about to deliver a blow that nearly undid everything they had accomplished. June 19th, 1944. 13 days after Day's triumph, 13 days after Allied forces had established their foothold in Hitler's fortress, nature decided to remind human beings who was really in charge. The English Channel, which had carried the greatest armada in history to victory, was about to become the instrument of potential defeat. Normandy hadn't seen a storm like it in 40 years. Weather that made the June 4th crisis look like a minor inconvenience. Winds that had torn German plans apart on Day now threatened to tear Allied plans apart in the crucial weeks that followed. The same force of nature that had nearly prevented the invasion was now threatening to make that invasion meaningless. Men did not need ports to land, but they now had a desperate need for artificial ports to continue the battle and to provide logistics and supplies for the hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers pouring into Normandy. Every day, 150 to 200 ships unloaded some 7,000 vehicles, 15,000 tons of supplies, and thousands of fresh troops in the artificial harbours at Arromanches on the British side and Omaha on the American side. These artificial harbours represented one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in military history. Huge concrete caissons called phoenixes had been towed across the channel and sunk to form breakwaters. Floating docks and steel pontoons provided access to the beaches, regardless of tide levels. It was a gigantic construction project that had made the day landings possible by eliminating the need to capture a real port immediately. But these engineering marvels had been designed to withstand normal channel weather, not the meteorological catastrophe that was approaching from the Atlantic. Inside the anchorages, ships were tossed around like rag dolls as waves grew higher than anyone had predicted. Vessels that had survived German artillery fire were now being smashed against each other by winds that treated steel hulls like children's toys. the wall of caissons was unable to withstand the cataclysm. Concrete structures that weighed thousands of tons were shifted by waves that struck with the force of geological events. Worse still, some of the caissons broke away entirely, letting waves surge into the supposedly protected harbors. The artificial ports that had taken months to design and weeks to install were being destroyed in hours by natural forces beyond human control. Floating docks and gangplanks became detached and were swept away like driftwood. Equipment that had been carefully positioned for efficient unloading was scattered across Norman beaches by waves that treated military logistics like debris. Supply dumps that represented weeks of careful planning were washed away in minutes by storm surges that reached farther inland than anyone had thought possible. The storm would last for a full 4 days, interrupting the supply of materials and reinforcements at the most critical moment of the Normandy campaign. Just when Allied forces needed maximum logistical support to break out of their beachheads, just when German resistance was beginning to crumble, nature cut the supply lines that made Allied superiority possible. For 4 days, the greatest military machine in history was reduced to fighting on whatever ammunition and fuel had been stockpiled before the storm struck. German commanders, monitoring Allied radio traffic from their bunkers, began to hope that nature might accomplish what their armies had failed to achieve. If Allied supply lines remained severed, if reinforcements couldn't reach Normandy, if the invasion force ran out of ammunition and fuel, perhaps the Third Reich might survive after all. For 4 crucial days, Hitler's generals allowed themselves to believe that weather might succeed where Wehrmacht had failed. Allied forces already ashore watched the destruction with growing alarm. Soldiers who had risked everything to establish beachheads now saw their lifelines to England being torn apart by forces they couldn't fight or negotiate with. The bravery that had conquered German defences was useless against winds that didn't care about national flags or political ideologies. On the morning of June 23rd, clear skies finally revealed the full extent of the catastrophe. The sorry sight of hundreds of ships and wrecks run aground along the beaches looked like the aftermath of a naval battle rather than a weather event. Twisted metal and broken concrete stretched for miles along the Norman coast. The artificial harbours that had seemed like miracles of engineering now looked like monuments to human hubris in the face of natural power. British engineers, with characteristic determination, quickly rebuilt the port of Arromanches. Working around the clock in conditions that would have challenged peacetime construction crews, they restored enough capacity to keep British and Canadian forces supplied. But the American port at Omaha remained out of commission. The beach that had nearly witnessed the greatest American military disaster in history was now experiencing the greatest American logistical disaster in history. The Allied plan was running 10 days late. 10 days that might have meant the difference between victory and stalemate. 10 days during which German forces could regroup, reinforce, and prepare new defensive positions. The storm hadn't defeated the Allied invasion, but it had given the German army something it desperately needed: time. American forces, cut off from their primary supply line, faced a desperate choice. They could remain on the defensive until the Omaha port was rebuilt, allowing German forces to strengthen their positions indefinitely. Or they could attempt to capture the deep water port of Cherbourg as quickly as possible, before their ammunition and fuel ran out completely. It was a race against time, and against the elements that would determine whether days' success could be sustained. But first, American forces had to fight their way through terrain that seemed specifically designed to destroy attacking armies. The Norman bocage, hedge country that would become a nightmare for Allied armor and infantry alike. The Americans had no choice but to pierce the enemy front in the Cotentin Peninsula. Not easy in a region of bocage, where the hedgerows made defense easier and attacking almost impossible. This was terrain that military planners hadn't fully understood when they designed the Normandy invasion. On aerial reconnaissance photographs, the bocage had looked like ordinary farmland divided by normal field boundaries. The reality was a maze of natural fortifications that favored defenders over attackers in every possible way. The bocage consisted of ancient field boundaries built up over centuries of Norman agriculture. Each field was surrounded by thick hedgerows growing on earthen banks that were often 6 feet high and topped with vegetation that could conceal entire companies of soldiers. What looked like pastoral countryside from the air was actually a series of natural bunkers connected by sunken lanes that provided invisible movement for defending forces. American soldiers discovered that they were fighting in a huge checkerboard maze where a handful of resilient combatants could stop an entire battalion. German defenders could observe attacking forces from concealed positions while remaining invisible themselves. When they did concede one of these square fields, they simply had to move back to the next hedgerow and repeat the process. Each field became a separate battle. Each hedgerow became a potential killing ground. American tanks were obliged to stick to the roads, making them easy targets for German anti-tank weapons. The narrow lanes between fields couldn't accommodate armored formations. When tanks tried to cross the earthen banks that supported the hedgerows, they exposed their unarmored bellies to enemy fire. German defenders with simple anti-tank rockets could destroy American armor worth hundreds of thousands of dollars with weapons that cost less than a month's pay. Just as dangerous was when American tanks had to cross levees, openly presenting their vulnerable undersides to German gunners who had prepared firing positions specifically to exploit this weakness. Tank crews who had survived the Atlantic crossing and the day landings found themselves being killed by German soldiers they never saw, firing from positions they couldn't locate, using terrain features that turned American technological superiority into a disadvantage. These bocage traps accounted for thousands of GI lives and resulted in a failed attempt to penetrate what American soldiers bitterly called this goddamn country. The profanity expressed frustration that went beyond normal combat stress. American troops had expected to fight German soldiers, German tanks, German artillery. They hadn't expected to fight the French countryside itself. But the bocage seemed to be actively hostile to American tactics, American equipment, and American lives. Young Americans who had grown up on Midwestern farms found themselves in an agricultural landscape unlike anything they had ever experienced. The wide open spaces of Kansas and Nebraska had not prepared them for fighting in a region where visibility was measured in yards rather than miles. Tank crews trained on American plains discovered that European farmland operated according to different rules. Infantry soldiers who expected to advance across open ground instead found themselves crawling through vegetation that concealed death at every turn. The psychological impact was as devastating as the tactical problems. American soldiers could fight German enemies, they could see and understand. But the bocage was an enemy that couldn't be defeated by superior firepower or better training. It was terrain that neutralized American advantages and amplified German strengths. Every field looked the same. Every hedgerow looked identical. Progress was measured not in miles but in individual fields captured at enormous cost. German defenders, many of whom had grown up in similar agricultural regions, understood how to use the bocage to maximum advantage. They could move invisibly through the sunken lanes that connected fields. They could establish firing positions that were virtually impossible to detect from ground level. They could retreat from one defensive position to another without exposing themselves to American observation or fire. The bocage made German infantry as effective as German armor in stopping American advances. American commanders faced tactical problems that weren't covered in any manual they had studied. How do you coordinate artillery fire when you can't see targets 50 yards away? How do you use air support when the enemy is invisible beneath vegetation? How do you maintain unit cohesion when companies become separated in terrain that blocks radio communication? The bocage was teaching American forces that superior technology meant nothing without terrain that allowed that technology to be used effectively. Week after week, American casualties mounted as forces that should have been advancing rapidly toward Cherbourg instead found themselves grinding forward field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, death by death. The bocage was consuming American lives at a rate that threatened to make the Normandy invasion strategically meaningless, even if it remained tactically successful. Victory was becoming Pyrrhic when every mile of advance cost hundreds of American lives. But American determination, backed by American industrial might, would eventually overcome even the bocage. And the prize that made all the sacrifice worthwhile was finally within reach. American troops had to capture the deep water port of Cherbourg as quickly as possible. Everything depended on seizing this prize before German resistance could solidify and before Allied supplies ran out completely. The port city at the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula represented salvation for the entire Normandy campaign. Without Cherbourg's harbour facilities, the Allied invasion would remain dependent on artificial ports that had already proven vulnerable to channel storms. Although surrounded by American forces, the city was still in German hands, under the command of Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben. The German garrison commander was a professional soldier who understood his duty even when that duty had become hopeless. Von Schlieben had oath sworn to Hitler to prefer death over the shame of surrender, but he also had responsibility for the thousands of German soldiers under his command. Finally, on June 26th, US infantry entered the suburbs of Cherbourg after weeks of grinding combat through the bocage countryside. The advance wasn't the triumphant liberation march that Allied planners had envisioned. Instead, it was the exhausted culmination of a campaign that had cost thousands of American lives for terrain that should have been captured weeks earlier. But it was victory nonetheless, and victory in war is measured by results, rather than by the elegance of the means used to achieve them. That same day, before a gathered press he clearly seemed not to appreciate, Lieutenant General von Schlieben surrendered the garrison and the port to American forces. The ceremony was brief and professional. Although this giant of a man politely wiped his feet before meeting his victor, the young General Lawton Collins, he nonetheless balked on his oath made to Hitler. Von Schlieben chose pragmatism over fanaticism, life over death, reality over ideology. He even surrendered before his men, who didn't lay down their weapons until the following day. 36,000 German prisoners were taken at Cherbourg, a huge number that revealed both the strength of German resistance and the completeness of German defeat. The average age of the prisoners, some old, some very young, showed the decline of the German army in the West. Hitler's best troops were fighting the Red Army on the Eastern Front. What remained in Normandy were teenagers too young for combat experience, and older men too old for sustained campaigning. The faces of captured German officers maintained a degree of haughtiness even in defeat. Or was it perhaps shame? Professional soldiers who had spent their careers serving the German state now found themselves prisoners of enemies they had been taught to despise. Some seemed relieved that their war was over. Others appeared stunned by the speed of American success. All were discovering what defeat meant for soldiers who had expected to win. Americans weren't always easy on prisoners, which was somewhat understandable given what they had endured. Since day, American forces had already lost 22,000 men in combat that should have ended weeks earlier. Every American casualty in the Bocage, every American death in the advance on Cherbourg, could be blamed on German resistance that prolonged a war whose outcome was no longer in doubt. Anger at German prisoners was anger at the unnecessary continuation of killing. With Cherbourg taken, one of the last sections of Hitler's Atlantic Wall had come tumbling down. The fortress that was supposed to protect Europe from Allied invasion had been reduced to rubble and German prisoners. The port facilities that would sustain the Allied advance into Germany were now in American hands. The supply crisis created by Channel storms could finally be resolved through conventional harbor operations rather than experimental artificial ports. But Cherbourg's capture came at a cost that revealed the true price of the Normandy campaign. American forces had suffered casualties that approached the worst nightmares of pre-invasion planning. The Bocage had consumed young American lives at a rate that made every tactical success feel like strategic failure. Victory was real, but victory was expensive in ways that would haunt American families for generations. With Americans trapped in Bocage hell and storms destroying their supplies, it had looked like day might fail after all. Then Omar Bradley conceived a plan so dangerous, it could save everything or destroy it completely. By late July 1944, the Normandy campaign had reached a crisis point that threatened to turn day's triumph into strategic failure. American forces remained trapped in the Bocage hell of hedge country. British forces had finally captured part of Cannes, but couldn't break through German defensive lines. German resistance, while weakening, was far from collapse. The Allied juggernaut that was supposed to liberate Europe was grinding to a halt just 50 miles from the beaches where it had landed 6 weeks earlier. General Omar Bradley, the quiet professional whom Eisenhower increasingly trusted over the theatrical Montgomery, studied his maps with growing determination. The American forces under his command had paid a terrible price to advance this far. 22,000 American casualties since day. Thousands more wounded, missing, or psychologically shattered by combat that exceeded every pre-invasion nightmare. But Bradley understood something that more flamboyant generals sometimes missed. Military success often required accepting military risks that seemed insane to safer minds. Bradley thought the Americans could break through enemy lines in the Cotentin Peninsula, but only through an operation so dangerous that failure would mean catastrophic defeat. The operation's code name was Cobra, like a snake that leans back before striking for the jugular. It would require precision bombing of German positions so close to American lines that the slightest miscalculation would kill more Americans than Germans. It would demand split-second coordination between air and ground forces under combat conditions where communication systems regularly failed. It would risk everything on a single, desperate gamble. The concept was brilliantly simple and terrifyingly complex. Allied bombers would saturate German defensive positions along a narrow front between Saint-Lô and Perriers, where the two armies faced each other in static warfare, reminiscent of the Western Front in 1917. The bombing would be followed immediately by coordinated attacks from American armor and infantry designed to punch through the gap before German reserves could respond. Once the breach was achieved, American forces would simultaneously advance on Brittany, the Seine, and the Loire, spreading across France like floodwater through a broken dam. To help his men get out of Bocage country, Bradley had planned to crush German positions on the front line with precision bombing raids that would make artillery bombardments look like gentle rain. But precision bombing in 1944 meant something very different from precision bombing in later wars. There were no guided missiles, no laser targeting systems, no satellite navigation. American pilots would navigate by landmark recognition, drop their bombs based on visual identification of targets, and hope that wind conditions, cloud cover, and enemy fire wouldn't affect their accuracy. The margin for error was measured in hundreds of yards. German positions that needed to be destroyed were sometimes less than 1,000 yards from American positions that needed to be protected. A navigational mistake, a miscalculated wind speed, a moment's confusion about landmark identification, any of these could result in American bombs falling on American soldiers. Bradley was asking his air forces to thread a needle while flying at 300 miles per hour through enemy anti-aircraft fire. The risks extended beyond friendly fire casualties. If the bombing failed to destroy German defenses, if the subsequent ground assault was repulsed, American forces would be left exposed and vulnerable to German counterattacks. Bradley was committing his reserves, his best equipment, and his most experienced units to an operation that would either achieve complete breakthrough or complete disaster. There would be no middle ground between triumph and catastrophe. German forces opposing Operation Cobra included elements of the famous armored division of General Fritz Bayerlein, Field Marshal Rommel's second-in-command. The Panzerlehr Division represented some of the finest remaining German armor in Normandy, experienced crews, modern equipment, and defensive positions that had been prepared over weeks of static warfare. If any German unit could stop Bradley's breakthrough attempt, it would be these professional soldiers fighting from carefully prepared positions in terrain that favored defenders. But Bradley had observed something that German commanders hadn't fully appreciated. The bocage that made attacking so difficult for American forces also made retreating difficult for German forces. The same hedgerows that had protected German defenders would become traps if American breakthrough achieved tactical surprise. German units that were scattered across individual fields would find it difficult to concentrate for coordinated counterattacks. The terrain that had been Germany's greatest defensive asset could become Germany's greatest tactical liability. On July 25th, Operation Cobra began with the largest tactical bombing operation in military history. Allied bombers attacked the narrow corridor between Saint-Lô and Perrier, where Bradley had chosen to concentrate his breakthrough attempt. The bombing was supposed to last exactly 90 minutes, long enough to destroy German resistance, short enough to prevent German reserves from responding. Everything depended on timing, accuracy, and the courage of ground forces who would have to advance through the same area that had just been saturated with high explosives. The results exceeded Bradley's most optimistic projections. The famous armoured division of General Fritz Bayerlein was wiped out in the first hour of bombing. Panzer tanks that had survived years of combat against British forces in North Africa were destroyed by American bombs in minutes. German defensive positions that had taken weeks to prepare were obliterated by explosives that fell like mechanical hail. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armoured formations, simply ceased to exist as a fighting unit. American ground forces could finally leave the hell of the bocage and force the long-awaited breakthrough. It was the breach in the enemy's front line that Allied planners had been hoping for since day. Tank crews who had spent weeks being picked off by German anti-tank weapons in hedge country suddenly found themselves advancing through open terrain where American mobility and firepower could be used to maximum advantage. Infantry soldiers, who had been crawling from hedgerow to hedgerow, were suddenly racing across French countryside in vehicles that covered more ground in hours than they had covered in weeks. Moreover, seeing the numbers of Germans who surrendered, American forces made a good catch, even if many in the net were only small fry. Prisoners included not just frontline combat soldiers but support personnel, administrative staff, and rear area units that had been caught in the collapse of German defensive positions. The breakthrough had achieved something more valuable than tactical success. It had achieved the psychological collapse of German resistance across an entire sector of the front. But breakthrough was only the beginning of Bradley's plan. Now, he would unleash the most aggressive American general of the entire war to exploit the gap that Cobra had created. At the first fart, they expect me to get them out of their shit, General George S. Patton was famously quoted as saying, and the crude language perfectly captured his approach to military leadership. Patton was profane, aggressive, and completely uninterested in the political sensitivities that constrained other Allied commanders. He understood one thing perfectly: how to turn tactical breakthroughs into strategic victories through relentless offensive action. The man who wore a Colt 45 in his holster was finally getting his chance to do what he did best: destroy German armies through speed, audacity, and the kind of calculated ruthlessness that made enemies fear American armor. For weeks, Patton had been commanding a phantom army designed to deceive German intelligence about Allied invasion plans. Now he would command a real army, the Third Army, in operations that would make his fictional exploits look conservative by comparison. Once Bradley's Cobra breakthrough had been achieved, American armored divisions reached Coutances, Avranches, and Granville, the last ports in Normandy before Brittany, even before July was over. The advance that had taken weeks to accomplish in Bocage country was now being measured in days across open French countryside. Patton's tanks were covering more ground in single afternoons than entire armies had covered during months of trench warfare in the previous war. In early August, the 2nd French Armoured Division landed at Utah Beach to join Patton's Third Army. For months, even years, these Frenchmen had left everything behind to fight Germans and Italians in North Africa. Only this time, they were ready to arrive as victors on their beloved French soil. Leading them was General Philippe Leclerc, as thin as his walking cane but valorous and upright in bearing. This aristocrat had all the social attributes to have sided with the Vichy collaboration government, but he had chosen to follow de Gaulle as early as June 1940. Now, he was landing as his homeland's liberator, commanding French armor that would finally participate in operations on French soil. Leclerc's division was integrated into Patton's American Third Army, creating a Franco-American partnership that symbolized the international nature of the Allied cause. Under pressure from Eisenhower, Montgomery had agreed to leave the organization of the final battle to the Americans. The British Field Marshal, who had delayed at Caen, now watched American forces achieve the breakthrough he had failed to accomplish. For a successful outcome, Bradley was counting on Patton to do what Patton did best: turn military success into complete enemy destruction through relentless pursuit and exploitation. As soon as the German counteroffensive had been stopped short at Mortagne, Patton and his divisions headed to Le Mans in the direction of Paris. But this wasn't just a race toward the French capital. Some of Patton's units suddenly turned off toward Argentan and made a wide, sweeping movement that threatened to encircle retreating German forces. While American armor raced north and east, British and Canadian forces were finally advancing south from the Cayenne sector. German armies that had been fighting separate battles against separate Allied forces suddenly found themselves facing a coordinated pincer movement. Patton's operational concept was breathtakingly simple and devastatingly effective. Instead of attacking German strength, he would exploit German weakness by advancing into areas where enemy resistance was lightest. Instead of fighting for every mile of ground, he would bypass German strongpoints and leave them for follow-up forces to capture later. Instead of methodical advances that gave enemies time to prepare new defensive positions, he would maintain such rapid movement that German commanders couldn't react quickly enough to stop him. The psychological impact of Patton's advance was as important as its tactical achievements. German soldiers who had been fighting a defensive war for weeks suddenly found American tanks in their rear areas, cutting supply lines and escape routes. Units that had been holding defensive positions discovered that those positions were now surrounded by American forces that had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. The static warfare that had characterized the Normandy campaign was giving way to the kind of fluid, mobile operations that favored American advantages in equipment, logistics, and air support. French civilians in towns and villages across Normandy watched in amazement as American columns raced past their homes at speeds that made occupation seem like a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent condition. Villages that had been under German control for 4 years were liberated, abandoned by retreating German forces, and then secured by follow-up American units in the space of single afternoons. Liberation was happening so quickly that some French communities were free before their inhabitants fully understood that the war had moved beyond them. Patton's advance represented everything that made American military doctrine effective in the industrial age. Superior logistics that could supply fast-moving armored formations across hundreds of miles of countryside. Superior communication systems that allowed rapid coordination between widely separated units. Superior air support that could respond immediately to requests for close air support from ground commanders. Most importantly, superior strategic mobility that turned tactical successes into operational victories through sustained exploitation of enemy weaknesses. While in the north, the Anglo-Canadians formed the other half of the pincer movement that would trap German forces between Argentan and Falaise. British forces that had been stalled outside Caen for weeks were finally advancing rapidly across terrain that German reserves could no longer defend. The breakthrough that Bradley had achieved, the exploitation that Patton was conducting, and the coordination that Eisenhower was directing were combining to create the most devastating defeat that German arms had suffered since Stalingrad. But the climax of this destruction would occur in a small area of Norman countryside, where German military power would meet its final catastrophic end. The German army was annihilated in a pocket of Norman countryside that would be remembered as one of the most complete military destructions in modern warfare. Eisenhower, surveying the battlefield after the fighting ended, called it the biggest bloodbath that any war zone had ever known. He added that only Dante could have been capable of describing the scenes of destruction that stretched across miles of French farmland. Bradley's pincer movement had worked exactly as planned. American forces advancing from the south met British and Canadian forces advancing from the north near the towns of Argentan and Falaise. Between these two prongs of the Allied advance, German armies that had been retreating in relatively good order suddenly found themselves trapped in a pocket with no way out, except through Allied forces that were prepared and waiting for them. The geography of the Falaise pocket created a killing ground of unprecedented efficiency. German forces crowded into a steadily shrinking area, while Allied artillery and air power concentrated their fire on targets that couldn't escape. Roads that should have carried retreating German columns became death traps where vehicles couldn't move forward or backward. Fields that should have provided concealment instead became open areas where German soldiers were exposed to observation and fire from multiple directions. For hundreds of yards, without interruption, Eisenhower stepped over dead and rotting flesh as he toured the battlefield. The Supreme Allied Commander, who had seen combat in 2 world wars, had never witnessed destruction on this scale. German soldiers, German equipment, German horses, German vehicles, all mixed together in a panorama of destruction that exceeded the worst nightmares of even experienced military professionals. The pocket had become a cemetery where an entire army group had been buried under Allied fire. Between 5,000 and 6,000 Germans were killed in the Falaise pocket. But the number of dead, while horrific, was less significant than the number of captured. From the look of those who were taken prisoner, it was clear that Eisenhower wasn't exaggerating the completeness of German defeat. These weren't just battlefield casualties. These were the remnants of military units that had simply ceased to exist as organized fighting forces. It would take several days to evacuate the 30,000 to 40,000 prisoners of war from the Falaise area. The logistics of handling this many captives challenged Allied administrative capabilities, almost as much as fighting them had challenged Allied military capabilities. Temporary camps had to be established. Food and medical care had to be provided. Transportation had to be arranged. Intelligence officers had to conduct interrogations. The machinery of war had to be converted into the machinery of peace, at least for the processing of prisoners who would spend the rest of the war in Allied custody. For the German prisoners, captivity represented a victory of sorts, the victory of life over death. Many looked stunned by the speed and completeness of their defeat. Others seemed relieved that their war was finally over. Some appeared grateful to have survived destruction that had claimed so many of their comrades. All were discovering that surrender could be a form of salvation when the alternative was annihilation. The German army had mobilized men from many of the countries it occupied during the conquest of Europe. Not all of the prisoners taken at Falaise were Germans fighting for the Third Reich. Some were Poles forced into German service. Others were Russians who had been captured on the Eastern Front and given the choice between starvation in prisoner-of-war camps or service in German units. Still others were French, Belgian, Dutch, or other European nationals who had been conscripted into German labor units that found themselves in combat zones when the front collapsed. Not all of these foreign soldiers in German uniforms were prepared to defend the Third Reich with their lives. Many surrendered at the first opportunity, relieved to be captured by Allied forces rather than killed fighting for a cause they had never chosen to support. Their presence among German prisoners revealed something important about the nature of Nazi military power. It depended increasingly on coerced rather than voluntary service. The master race was conscripting its supposed inferiors to defend its supposed superiority. The destruction at Falaise marked the end of effective German resistance in Normandy. With the Battle of Falaise won and German prisoners dispatched to rear areas, Patton's armies crossed the Seine and the Loire rivers. Eisenhower had now attained the two geographical objectives established in the original Operation Overlord planning. The invasion that had begun on the beaches of Normandy had achieved its initial strategic goals. Now the Supreme Allied Commander wanted to move on to the next step, the push toward Germany itself. The German army was finished in Normandy, but the war was not yet finished in Europe. German forces were retreating across France, but they weren't surrendering. Hitler was preparing new defensive positions along Germany's western borders. The battle for France was ending, but the battle for the Third Reich itself was just beginning. Yet even as German military resistance crumbled, even as Allied victory in Normandy became complete and undeniable, political complications were developing that would test the Allied coalition as severely as German resistance had tested it. The partnership that had made day possible was about to face challenges that military victory alone couldn't resolve. Liberation was proving easier to achieve than cooperation among the liberators. With German armies destroyed, the liberation of Paris was within reach. But Charles de Gaulle had plans that would shock even his Allied saviors. On August 19th, 1944, a blanket of smoke hung over Paris. On the ground, with news of the Allies' approach, the city had risen up against its German occupiers. But Charles de Gaulle had no intention of allowing the liberation of France's capital to be just another Allied military operation. He was about to execute the most audacious political coup of the entire war. The next day, de Gaulle appeared at Eisenhower's headquarters with a proposal that would fundamentally change the nature of the liberation. The Supreme Allied Commander wanted to avoid turning Paris into another battlefield. His strategy was to surround the capital, forcing the Germans to surrender and pick the city like a ripe fruit. It was militarily sound, strategically sensible, and politically naive. De Gaulle understood something that military commanders often missed. Liberation was as much about symbols as strategy. The eloquent French leader managed to persuade Eisenhower to enter Paris immediately, not just to avoid a possible bloodbath, but to prevent communist resistance members from claiming credit for the city's liberation. The general who had spent 4 years building free French legitimacy wasn't about to let domestic rivals steal his moment of triumph. Ike yielded to de Gaulle's arguments, but not without extracting concessions. Bradley agreed to detach Leclerc's 2nd Armoured Division, which had won renown at Falaise, so that it would be the first Allied unit into Paris. This was more than military coordination. It was political theatre designed to show the world that France was liberating itself, with Allied support, not being liberated by Allied forces. The distinction mattered enormously to de Gaulle, who had spent 4 years of exile fighting 2 wars simultaneously. One war against German occupation of French territory, the other war against Allied assumptions about French sovereignty. Roosevelt had wanted to treat liberated France as occupied enemy territory under American military government. De Gaulle intended to prove him wrong. After several fierce battles south of Paris, the sky over the capital's suburbs finally turned blue again. Women wore red clothing, and men sported white shirts, forming a tricolour celebration to welcome Leclerc's tanks at the gates of the city. French civilians who had endured 4 years of German occupation were finally seeing French soldiers return as liberators. But de Gaulle's political manoeuvring extended far beyond symbolic gestures. Even as fighting continued in Paris streets, he was installing French administrative officials in government buildings without consulting Allied commanders. Police stations, town halls, ministry buildings, all were being staffed with de Gaulle's appointees, who took orders from the provisional government of the French Republic, not from Allied headquarters. De Gaulle denied Allied commanders any say in France's political choices and forced them to recognize his authority in liberated territory. It was a masterful demonstration of how political skill could achieve what military power alone couldn't accomplish. The general who had refused to accept defeat in 1940 was now refusing to accept liberation on anyone's terms except his own. On that historic day in Paris, the gamble of the man who had appealed to the French people on June 18th, 1940, had finally paid off. The obscure brigadier general who had defied Churchill and Roosevelt was now standing in liberated Paris as the undisputed leader of the French nation. The miracle had happened. France, once crushed and humiliated, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the victors. The following day, on a less magical Place de la Concorde, political reality intruded on patriotic celebration. At the head of a country whose political future was still uncertain, de Gaulle asked Eisenhower to publicly back his authority before the French people. Eisenhower happily obliged, as did General Bradley. However, it was modesty alone that kept American commanders in the background as de Gaulle took center stage. The American leaders understood that French cooperation was essential for Allied success, and French cooperation required French dignity. De Gaulle's authority was the price of French partnership in the continuing war against Germany. Yet none of this political maneuvering would have been possible without the courage of French soldiers who had earned the right to liberate their own capital. General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armoured Division had travelled farther than any other Allied unit to reach the liberation of Paris. Not just the physical distance from Normandy beaches to the heart of France, but the emotional distance from defeat in 1940 to victory in 1944. These French soldiers had spent years fighting in North Africa, learning their trade against German forces in desert campaigns. Now they were returning to French soil as the spearhead of French liberation. Leclerc himself embodied the contradictions of French resistance to German occupation. This aristocrat, as thin as his walking cane, but valorous and upright in bearing, had all the social attributes that should have led him to support Vichy collaboration. Instead, he had chosen to follow de Gaulle as early as June 1940, when resistance seemed hopeless and collaboration seemed practical. The 2nd Armoured Division represented the internationalization of the French resistance movement. Some soldiers were Metropolitan French, who had escaped to North Africa after the 1940 defeat. Others were colonial troops from French territories in Africa. Still others were Spanish Republicans who had fled Franco's dictatorship and found new purpose, fighting fascism in French uniforms. All were united by loyalty to an ideal of France that transcended political divisions. Integration into Patton's American Third Army had given Leclerc's division the equipment and support needed to fight as a modern mechanized force. American tanks, American trucks, American radios, American ammunition, all serving French officers and French soldiers who had maintained their national identity while adopting Allied military doctrine. It was practical demonstration that the Free French movement was a genuine partner in the coalition against Nazi Germany. The honor of being first Allied unit into Paris carried enormous symbolic weight beyond military significance. For 4 years, French civilians had watched foreign armies march through their streets, first German armies as conquerors, then as occupiers. Now they would see French armies returning as liberators, supported by Allied firepower, but carrying French flags and singing French songs. Leclerc's tanks rolling through Parisian streets represented the restoration of French military honor that had been shattered in 1940. These were French soldiers who had learned to fight and win, who had proven themselves in combat against the same German forces that had humiliated France 4 years earlier. Their presence in liberated Paris demonstrated that French defeat had been a temporary setback, not a permanent collapse. The Liberation Day euphoria that greeted Leclerc's division was unlike anything Paris had experienced since the armistice celebration at the end of the First World War. Crowds that had been suppressed for 4 years suddenly filled the streets with noise, color, and celebration. French flags appeared on buildings where they had been forbidden. French songs were sung where they had been banned. French soldiers were embraced by French civilians, who had almost forgotten what it felt like to see their countrymen in uniform as symbols of hope. French women who had endured 4 years of German occupation now embraced French soldiers who represented both liberation and redemption. These weren't just military victories, they were personal victories over humiliation, fear, and despair. Every French face in the crowd was a rejection of the Nazi claim that France was a defeated nation that deserved to be dominated by a superior race. The 2nd Armoured Division's entry into Paris marked the end of one phase of the war and the beginning of another. French territory was being liberated, but German territory still had to be conquered. Liberation was complete, but victory was not. The hardest fighting might still lay ahead. Yet even in the moment of triumph, The true cost of victory was becoming visible to those who looked beyond the celebrations. The final Allied casualty count from the Normandy campaign revealed numbers that would haunt military planners for generations. 209,000 Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or reported missing in the 11 weeks between Day and the liberation of Paris. 209,000 young men who had volunteered to liberate Europe and paid with their blood, their limbs, or their lives. These weren't just statistics in military reports. They were human beings whose absence would be felt in countless communities across Britain, Canada, America, and the other Allied nations. Families who would never be complete again. Children who would grow up without fathers. Parents who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what their sons might have achieved if they had lived. The mathematics of liberation included calculations that couldn't be measured in tactical objectives or strategic goals. American casualties alone totaled more than 124,000. From the boys who died in the surf at Omaha Beach, to the tank crews killed in Bocage country, to the infantry soldiers who fell in the final battles around Falaise. The democracy they died to preserve would spend decades trying to honor their sacrifice, while understanding what that sacrifice had cost. British and Canadian casualties added tens of thousands more names to the rolls of the dead and wounded. The empire that had stood alone against Hitler in 1940 had paid in blood for the victory that vindicated that lonely resistance. Commonwealth soldiers from across the globe had died on Norman beaches to prove that democracy could defend itself against totalitarian aggression. But the human cost extended beyond Allied casualties to include German soldiers who had fought and died for a cause that history would judge to be evil. German military casualties in Normandy approached Allied losses, but their composition told a different and more tragic story. The average age of German prisoners, some old, some very young, showed the desperation of a regime conscripting grandfathers and teenagers to defend indefensible positions. Many German soldiers captured in the final weeks were boys who should have been in school and old men who should have been enjoying retirement. Hitler's master race was defending itself with soldiers who represented either the beginning or the end of military careers. The experienced professionals who had conquered most of Europe were dead, wounded, or fighting the Red Army. What remained were the dregs of German manpower, pressed into service by a regime that preferred to sacrifice its own people rather than admit defeat. French civilian casualties added another dimension to the hidden cost of liberation. 20,000 French men, women and children had been killed during the 11 weeks of fighting that liberated their country. Some died from German brutality as occupying forces took revenge. Others died from Allied bombing as military necessity demanded attacks that couldn't discriminate between military and civilian targets. All died so that France could be free. What victory really meant became clear only when the celebrations ended and the counting began. Military success had been achieved through human sacrifice on a scale that challenged every assumption about the value of political freedom. Day had succeeded in its immediate military objectives, establishing a second front, liberating Western Europe, hastening the defeat of Nazi Germany. But Day had also revealed the cost of opposing evil in a world where good and evil were willing to use the same terrible means. The young men who died on Norman beaches had preserved a world where moral questions could be asked freely. Their sacrifice made possible the luxury of moral doubt about the means used to achieve moral certainty about the ends. The liberation of Europe was complete, but its consequences would echo through the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Our story has been high in color, but the original images are often in black and white. In the end, whether in color or black and white, each piece of footage tells us about the fate of all those men who took part in the Normandy landings. So many of them anonymous among the massed troops. Who were you, lost amongst the crowd of faces? Or you, turning around? 27-year-old Sergeant Ian Grant, always wearing his Scottish beret, who chose the film corps to escape chores and immortalize his brothers in arms. 20-year-old Desmond O'Neill, whose camera was welcome because it distracted the men, wounded while filming but never stopping his work. Norman Clegg, whose clapperboard was all that history preserved of him after German fire, claimed his life 5 days after day. The paratroopers with scarlet war paint, whether real Native Americans or soldiers embracing the myth of the warrior, transforming scared young men into something fierce and primal. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, who became warriors preparing for the hunt. Even the German soldier playing organ in a ruined Norman church. Was he a madman, a music lover, or just a lost soldier seeking escape from the Holocaust scenery around him? A human moment of beauty amid the machinery of death. All participated in this staggering event which, contrary to legend, was no victory march. Each face in the crowd helped change the course of human history. Each anonymous hero made freedom possible for generations yet unborn. Whoever you are, thank you.